You are now disrupting the order, and that pisses me off, and it's very obnoxious, and I have no reason to platform you anymore going forward. So consider this your last panel, Furby, just out of disrespect. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Raging Tomato. I am Sarah, bringing to you live another Moderator Monday, but on a Friday night. We've got a pop-up debate stream. I love these. And going forward, any 1v1s will be held on the weekends, so keep an eye out for the pop-ups like so. This evening, I have Melanie, the Cosmic Fox, and Rob Noir making his debut on a debate here. They will be battling out the question of, is gender different from sex? I'm interested to know what this difference may or may not be. Mel, if you'd like to kick off with your opening statement, please. You're muted.
Hello, yes. So first of all, thank you to Sarah for hosting this debate and to Rob for having this debate for me. For those who are interested, I think we're going to both roughly target 4 minutes, but not strictly, just for out of common courtesy. I am here tonight to take the affirmative, near absolutist stance on sex and gender are pretty much entirely different things. In fact, they're so different, it's hard to call them the same thing. Sex, well, here, let me give you just a one-liner, right? Sex is our physical attributes, gender is a mental attribute. So when it comes down to it, sex is a common theme throughout the planet, right? Plants and animals can have a sex and they are born with it. There's core biological sex, which is the fertilization between a small gamete and a large gamete. But there's also the sex of an object, and that is defined by whether or not a nominal, bimodally distributed set of characteristics of one set or another point to the production of small or large gametes. Gender is a set of intrinsic inclinations any human may have, which are enacted by that individual in accordance with social expectations about sexual presentation. So if I want to belong to a certain group, say women, I'm going to ask, well, what do women do in society? And I'm going to answer that with my behaviors. In fact, some even reduce it down to something called speech acts, but we can get there if we need. Proceeding to behave accordingly is an expression of desire to be a part of that group, is what I'm essentially saying. A man is the performance of an individual, a man is the performance of an individual trying to be seen as a man. So I know that sounds circular, but that is actually how we use this. Why? Because these things change culturally, folks. And I forgot to run my timer, so I'm going to assume that was 2 minutes and for 2 more minutes.
You're fine.
The term man and woman are often, but not always, define what the other is not. So a woman does what a man doesn't. A man does what a woman doesn't. Nature's not really like that, by the way, and I think we'll get into this. There are 4 main facets of these sort of things that kind of come into this discussion. The first are physiological and bodily aspects. Most of that is just reproductive sex, but we can call some of that gender expression, like secondary sex characteristics. When I'm looking at someone on the streets to figure out what sex or gender they are, you can use either when figuring out their pronouns, then I am looking mostly at their secondary sex characteristics, right? Not their chromosomes, not their hormones, not their genitals, because we normally conceal those. I am looking at that in particular. So if we come into the question of what is a man or what is a woman, I think we'll have interesting conversations about what is a necessary condition. So gender and sex are distinct concepts, although they can be intertwined, although there are plenty of things that are intertwined that don't necessarily, that don't need to be delineated. So for example, there are certain things in sports, there are certain statistics that can be similar, but that doesn't mean that you get that statistic the same way. And so we don't consider all those sports to be the same category. I don't know if Rob's a sports fan. He seems like one to me, so I was trying to do a sports thing there. Were you keeping track, Sarah? How much longer do I have?
You go as long as you need. We're not worried about it.
You're fine. You're fine, Mel.
I mean, I have, okay, well, here. I'm just going to summarize, actually, because I want to get to the meat of this debate. So at the end of the day, these are things that aren't just different concepts, they occur in radically different ways. One of these things you were born with. The other thing, in terms of the question, what is a woman, you become over time. How can those possibly be the same concepts? And with that, I finished my opening or something. I don't know. My brain's not working well tonight.
That's okay, Furby. You're all good. Thank you so much. And Rob, to you.
All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate everyone being here. Happy to be here as an official debater for the first time. Hopefully the first of many times. So a topic that probably the people listening have heard been debated many times over. I don't find it particularly a topic where there's much new area to broach, but I always enjoy talking to someone because I find the specific definitions of these terms to be incredibly interesting. The term gender is now being used by people that are activists and engage in sort of a cultural Marxism in order to justify interchanging words when they find suitable to get cultural and political victories. They would have you believe sex is malleable, and they'll insert terms like men and women when it suits them to talk about sex when they're using those terms that they call gender. For example, we'll see throughout this debate that there are often people on the left that will talk about studies show that men are more likely to be aggressive than women. Studies show that women make 79 cents to the dollar than men. But then they'll tell you, well, actually, man and woman doesn't mean the sex characteristics. It means sort of self-referential, what you feel like, or exhibiting sort of the behaviors that you think that those sort of biological realities would be. They use this as a clever trick that they'll be able to attack men when they feel like it, which they view as an oppressor group, but then simultaneously say when pushed, oh, no, we're not attacking men. We're talking about the gender expressions that come therefore from. The idea that gender was different from sex is sort of a new concept that occurred in the 50s, and it came from queer theorists. We could get to the actual person that was most responsible for pushing this, but suffice it to say that it was a radical sort of Marxist-type belief that was used to try to subvert sort of the established orthodoxy, as we saw a time when communism was failing and Marxism was failing spectacularly. There was no equivalent term that captured this distinction between biological sex and what they'll call social psychological aspects of identity, or which Mel has identified as sort of the idea of what people think is presented by the sex. It's sort of a crazy definition. It actually uses the term man in defining what a man is, which shows that that definition is ludicrous. All of these definitions will come down to sort of self-subjectivism. At the end of the day, Mel's going to be forced to argue that a man is basically someone who says they think they're a man. It might be the extra step of they think they're a man because they think they're exhibiting the characteristics that they feel men should exhibit, but nonetheless it'll be self-subjective, which is going to be defeating and proves the word to be meaningless. Nonetheless, we could see that before this sort of change in what gender was, pre-1950, the word was almost used always as sort of a grammatical category of the idea of sex. So when you hear people talking about it circa 1800, early 1900s, and all times before that, man was just an adult male and woman was just an adult female, and boy was a male that was not an adult and girl was a female that was an adult. These are the ways that terms was used, and in fact, one of the reasons that the word gender started to be used was because actually using the word sex was considered uncouth. But for all effects and purposes, gender and sex were the same thing. It was just grammatical differences in words like pronouns and how you would use it. And I would argue that the fact that that was radically changed by someone with a political and cultural axe to grind in the 50s would show that the true definition for the history of time was that there actually is no marital difference between the idea and the concepts of gender and sex. It's just embraced by people that are pushing this sort of cultural and political values. Remember, if the term is subjective, if woman means anyone who calls themselves a woman, then the term becomes meaningless because in communication, we have the sender and receiver. The real understanding of the importance of a word is that the receiver has an understanding of what that word means. And if the word only means what the sender thinks it means, then the receiver has no idea of what that word actually means. For example, we could say that language is a social construct, and so the term tall means anyone that's over 1'5" inches. But then when you say, guess what? A tall guy stole my car, that means that I would have to assume that it's anyone from 1'5" inches to someone that's 7 feet tall. It renders the term completely meaningless. And language is important to have categories so that we as humans could understand each other. When people for political and cultural reasons seek to subvert that in order to make these terms, and the effect of it is that these terms then become meaningless because they just basically mean, well, man is what I think that a man does, then the term becomes meaningless, which further proves that I will be able to negate this, that actually gender is not different from sex. In almost all aspects in how we use the term man and woman, we see that the term is used in the useful sense, meaning basically grammatical categories of sex. For example, if we go through a litany of history and the studies that talk about the differences between men and women, none of them actually went through and asked all the people. For example, women make 79 cents, which is basically a bullshit stat anyways, to women. They didn't actually ask, oh, and by the way, do you identify as a woman? They were using sex. That's what the term meant there. So that's my opening statement, and I'll be happy to get into the rest of it.
Thank you to both of you. And kind reminder, everyone, we will go into open panel after this. We will have the debate. We will read and respond to super chats, and then we will open up the open panel dumpster fire per usual. Both of you, I leave the floor open.
Okay, so let me start with a rebuttal to everything you just said.
Everything?
Yeah, I did take notes, and that's what I do, so that way we don't have to interrupt each other as much. So you said this is used by people who are activists and cultural Marxists. From what I've read, this was actually started more by postmodernism. Some of those people may have been Marxists, but definitely not all of them. Would you say that that might sound like a better word to you?
Postmodernism actually is sort of a philosophy that has to do with eliminating the idea of capital T truth. Would you agree with that? Just so we get our terms correct, is it fair for me to explain what I think postmodernism is? Is that okay?
It's about critiquing former notions of capital T truth.
Right, but they don't believe in sort of that there is a capital T truth. They think that truth is subjective. And so queer theorists like John Money that popularized this term, they were a queer theorist which talked about the importance of using activism in places like academia in order to subvert concepts of truth. So I would
Money, can I just point some stuff out since that was a lot? First of all, Money only introduced the word used as we know it now to the scientific literature. It was used way before that by people like Judith Butler and stuff like that. In terms of the people who were post-truth, the post-capital T truth group, some of them were postmodernists. It was a common theme in postmodernism, but they were discussing it. Not all of them were actually post-truth. Some of them still thought can you give me an example
of one?
But for example, sex is an objective truth. Reproductive sex is an objective truth. No. We can look at someone's chromosomes. We cannot look at someone's gender. We cannot figure out what someone's gender is.
Just real quick, I promise I won't interrupt much here. You're not saying some postmodernists believed in capital T truth. You're saying some truths postmodernists believe. That's the argument you're making?
Yeah, I'm saying they weren't against all truths. They definitely agreed with an objective reality, but they were trying to say, like, well, for example, the category of man and woman, taking that for granted that assumes their sex right out the gate, that can be misleading. And sex is something that applies to more than just humans, yet man and woman is a human-specific category. So to try to relate that to sex could be erroneous. For example, taking for granted that all people who have a certain gender will identify with their genitalia.
Okay, so if I could rebut this. First, I think the vast majority of postmodernism, from my limited redneck understanding of it, admittedly, by no means am I a big Michel Foucault understander, but I think that a lot of it has to do with sort of the rejection of capital T truth, and a lot of it's rooted in things like Marxism. Queer theory itself was attempting to subvert common accepted ideas of what truth was, and it sought to break people in sort of a oppressor versus oppressed mindset. We can see that this is done through all sorts of categories, whether it be through race, through economics, through ability, through biological sex, etc. And in that subversion, it sought to create activists and use language in order to control a narrative. So I guess my first question to you would be, if there is such utility in the way that John Money and the postmodernists, or the queer theorists, however you want to put it, I'm not really interested in the semantics of that. If there's such utility in the way that they have changed this form, one, will you admit that the word gender ultimately meant the grammatical expression of sex for the vast majority of human history? And second, how was there a lack of utility of that term before it was changed by these queer theorists?
So first of all, no, I will not agree that that's how it started. It actually started as another way. Like if you look at the term genre and stuff like that, it came from a lot of similar root words for kind or category and stuff like that. So it is of itself a category, and it's always been used as a category for utility. You said something interesting to me,
right? A grammatical
common
category.
Ideas. So I just want to respond to everything you said as a whole, because I'm not interested in debating postmodern ideas specifically at the moment. You said common ideas. I don't think all of these ideas prove to be useful once we had better information. Like, for example, the information that not everyone might identify with their genitalia. Well, that's useful because then we don't make statistical or categorical errors. Do you see what I mean?
Well, but no, because what you'll see is the way that that's used when we're talking about studies and we're using in academic literature, straight down to colloquially, the way the average people use the term is using the term as literally connected to biological sex. For example, are you aware of studies that are cited by feminists all the time that say that women make 79 cents to the dollar than men?
So, okay,
Just a yes or no would suffice
I
for now,
am,
because
I am, but
I want to expound upon it.
I have,
So please,
I, have a, I am,
promise.
but I have a counterpoint.
Okay, that's fair.
I am
You can-
familiar,
and you can
but I
get
have
your-
a counterpoint.
That's totally fair, and I promise to give you a chance to issue that counterpoint. Well, given that, if those terms clearly aren't being used, that you're not suggesting that those studies asked each individual in those studies whose salaries they were looking at how they identified, are you?
No, I think you're making a different argument. I think you're actually arguing that none of these studies that you're citing conform to that postmodern ideal, which is true. There's still a lot of studies that can be outdated that are even coming out recently by that standard. So it's not a ubiquitous thing in the literature by any sense.
But the problem you're going to have is every time we use that term in some sort of utility where we're seeking to understand pragmatic differences between outcomes between men and women, and almost every time it's using that term using biological sex. And if that's the most common way that it's used, even in the academic literature, certainly it'll be easy for me to prove that outside the scope of sort of radical left-wingers, that's the way that the average people are using it. So why should we assume that because some radical people want to subjectively say, well, when it suits us politically or culturally, we think that it means different than sex. But when we're using studies that imply that women are disadvantaged and we want to argue from that sort of left-wing cultural Marxist perspective that men are oppressors and women are the oppressed, then it's okay for us to use those terms meaning biological sex.
Well, because what these people are trying to tackle is an issue. It's an issue that leads to statistical problems, medical problems, all sorts of systematic issues for trans and gender nonconforming people, where when you take for granted that calling someone a woman means they're a reproductive woman with XX chromosome specifically and lots of estrogen flooding through her system, as well as being fertile, then you not only kind of stereotype that category and make essential claims about them that are not necessarily backed up by your literature, but also you basically erase those people, right? Now, would you agree that, like, if we were to erase all white men, just like pretend like they don't exist in any of the medical literature and stuff like that, just never mention them, that might be a bad thing?
But that's not what's happening. It's not erasure like that. For example, studies that reference men and women aren't talking about all sorts of other subcategories, but that doesn't mean we're erasing them. For example, a study between a man and woman might not take into account men who are schizophrenic. So are they being erased because this study had to do with men and women? The fact that there are people out there with mental disorders that think that they are in the wrong body biologically, my heart goes out to those people, but by no means does that mean they're being erased, because we have a utility for terms that we've had for years and decades in both the academic literature and in colloquial sense, and we all understand what those words mean, but a couple people felt left out because they have some sort of disorder, and so we have to remake our entire language to suit them. And we see the negative ramifications of that. Now we've catered to this small
can I
mind.
respond
Real quick, please.
Can you
Let him finish his thought. Let him
Just
finish
real
his
quick.
thought, and then the floor is back to
And
you.
so we can see how that control.
started.
So we can see how that control of language has helped lead to the catering of this small minority population that basically have mental disorders, to the point where we're actually saying that biological men get to compete in female sports. That we have to change our entire structure of the separation of men and women in places like restrooms. That we're said that we have to get rid of our cultural norms. All of this started with a control of language, which you're incapable of defending that there's utility in that.
So a lot of that was actually non sequitur, because it does not follow that those things necessarily create issues.
We could argue.
But I'm going to address specifically the need for us to actually not erase those groups. So when you have a categorical error in your research, you specifically do not include research on groups that are a significant variable to your research, then you're actually missing data. And that data could give you different results. And the fact that it could give you different results also means that the results that you got without that data could be wrong. And so it makes sense that you actually want to include that data. This is not catering to an entire group. This is recognizing other variables that may exist in an equation.
So if I choose to subjectively define the term man as people with small gametes who don't have schizophrenia, and I say that women are all other groups, and then I say the fact that you're unwilling to accept that means that when you do a study that says men are more likely than women to do X, that's erasing biological males with schizophrenia. Do you see the absurdity of that?
Well, it's absurd to say that like the category would involve people who don't have schizophrenia because it does not follow that sexual reproductive function has anything to do with schizophrenia.
But it doesn't follow that. That's irrelevant to the question. You have a
No,
subjective.
but like
It
you
is.
created.
I'll explain why. The metaphor still works because your objection to it's irrelevant to what I'm discussing. Because by the same token, the idea of how you subjectively feel the expression of a normal man and woman is, so you subjectively call yourself, has nothing to do with the physical nature of what the term man and woman have meant throughout history.
So if you
including
want
all
me
of
to
these
agree
studies.
that your unrealistic hypothetical is ridiculous, then yes, that is ridiculous. But it's not realistic because that's not what you're going to see in the literature, since a huge part of being a scientist means observing which variables do apply and which ones don't.
Show me a study.
So if you're doing a study on schizophrenia and sex differences, that might be a good way to control for a certain group to see if there's anything that pops out from the other group, which are the men who don't have schizophrenia as well as women, just in case there's any sort of covariable there. But you might want to have a hypothesis for why that would be relevant. So what you did there is essentially straw person the scientific method.
I didn't straw person the scientific method. Now, notice what you did there was you just directly connected sex and sexual reproduction with the concept of gender. So in
Yes, they are interconnected.
Please. So
But
your
as I pointed out in my introduction,
You got it. You owe her an interruption back.
You got it then.
Go ahead, Mel.
they are interconnected, but as I pointed out with the sports stuff, just because things are interconnected does not mean they're the same.
So when you said in your opening statement that, quote, you let off saying they're entirely different, that's clearly not the case. And any expression that people any expression that people try to say that there is sort of a difference between biological sex and the concept of gender, right? Most of the time what they'll say is something like a definition you gave, your proprietary definition that says what has to do with what people think men traditionally do. We'll get to problems with that definition in a second. But notice it has to do with the subjective idea.
That was an example,
please.
by the way. That was really bad faith.
Hold on. Let him finish his thought, Mel, and then we'll turn it right back to you.
Right. So what you see then is that, like, when you get right down to it, it's always an expression of what we assume the normal expression of biological characteristics are, concepts of male and female. So even with your definition, you could see that it's intrinsically tied to sex, which it had been throughout all of history. And then you make this mistake of saying, yes, but there's no reason that we shouldn't change terms if we have more specific terms, and that's what the academic literature has done. No, it hasn't done that, other in the concept of trying to use this as a subversion for the utility in this. But the same sorts of people that use these arguments that are cultural Marxists or people on the left, as soon as it comes to wanting to attack the biological males, what they do is all of a sudden do studies on men and women that go back to that definition. So I'll ask you, you already conceded the vast majority of studies that are comparatively discussing women being disadvantaged are talking about biological sex and the term gender as an expression of that. Can you name me one study that's talking about women being oppressed where it says that there is a difference in outcomes between men and women that's actually went and asked each individual person in that study how they self-identify? Or are they using it as an expression of biological reality?
So I find that to be somewhat irrelevant because I'm not actually making the case that the literature is perfect. So if the literature were imperfect, that wouldn't destroy any of my claims. You said I had a proprietary definition, and then you used a very cherry-picked point from my definition that was actually supposed to be an example to give you better comprehension, which you seem to be struggling with. So here, let me reread the first part without that, so that way you can have better comprehension. Gender is a set of intrinsic inclinations any human may have, which I'll add to this, which align with the sexual schema. Keyword there, schema, so maybe Google that if you don't know it. But these are enacted by that individual in accordance with societal expectations about presentation, and they do that to belong to the group that they feel inclined to belong to. The terms man and women are often, but not always, defined by what the other is not. Is there any part of there that you're lost on?
Yes, it's irrelevant to what I said was with the way you defined man. So you read how you define gender, but based on that definition, implying it, then you went through how to define specific gender.
Because I can't tell you because these things
Yes or
vary
no? I'll just
incredibly.
ask you yes or no. Did you say the definition of man is someone who feels that some form of this, I didn't get the exact wordage, but something to do with someone who's expressing what they think the physical characteristics of a man is? Wasn't that basically
So
your
I will
definition?
read this example. This example, it's kind of like a derivative definition, but it's not really a definition of man. A man is the performance an individual does to be seen as part of a socially designated group defined by the enacted rituals that we commonly associate with men as a whole. And I know that's a big string of words, but all that's basically saying is if society says men does X and person feels like they should belong to group X based on their intrinsic identity, then they're probably going to perform those things. Now, the reason I can't tell you what those rituals can be, because these vary incredibly by culture, not just from like one society to the next or one nation to the next, but down to the local level. Even if you go to the city in the same state, you can find different forms of gender presentation that you wouldn't find out in the country.
Okay, so just getting back to, if we look at what the question of the prompt was, it's is gender different than sex? You started to talk about when I said that it was sort of a grammatical expression of biological reality of sex. One of the arguments you made that was that, you know, the scientific literature doesn't go this way, and academically it would be a reason to not prefer the sort of definition that I'm throwing out. And yet you yourself are incapable of citing one academic study, not even one, in which the term man is woman is used as you're suggesting when it comes to discussing the differences in outcomes between men and women. And you try to hand wave that away and say, well, just because it's not perfect. It's not that it's not perfect. You can't even give one example. I could give you example over and over again of studies that have referenced outcomes between actions in prison, actions when it comes to sexual assault, actions when it considers violence, the amount of pay that men and women, pay disparities that they have, the amount of hours that they work, on and on and on. Every one of those studies are going to be based on using gender and the term man and woman based on the sexual reality of if they're male or female. They did not go and ask each individual in that, oh, we say men commit 80% of violent crimes. So when we arrest them as we're taking the statistics, we say, excuse me, do you identify as a man? If all of a sudden all of these people say, you know what, I see an advantage in saying I identify as a woman, then the statistics may say something like women commit 60% of violent crimes. Now, it's not that the biological reality has changed, and the utility of a study like that would be to understand the actual pragmatic things that occur in the real world so that we could attempt to have an understanding and solution. But because of your proprietary definition and people that push those things out there, now those studies lose all meaning because we have no effing clue what we're talking about, because the term just means, well, this person that committed a crime subjectively views themselves as a gender, and we have no idea what the connection to biological reality is. Can you, like, the fact that you can't even give one study seems to suggest to me that you've lost the debate.
Plenty of studies, just not.
Last
Land
point
it.
real quick. You can't cite even one study of sort of pragmatism in talking about the outcome differences between men and women. Seem to suggest to me, as I suggested in my opening statement, that even with the academic literature and with studies, gender is not different than sex.
So sorry, I was trying to be silly there, but then I fucked up. So
I was like, is there a
Game
piano?
no, it's not, because for one thing, the fact that I can't provide a study within your very narrow conditions only proves that there's not a study for your narrow conditions. I have plenty of studies for the other thing. A great study that actually talks about everything you're referring to is called What is Gender Anyways? A Systematic Review of the Literature. It basically talks about how to solve this problem and identifies that it's not a simple solution. Now, I could just as easily ask you something that you can't live up to, like show me a study that took a significant sample size and asked people, do you identify with your genitals, and got 100% yes every time. Because if they don't, then that might mean that there can be an incongruence between identity and genitals. That incongruence between identity and genitals is proof that identities and genitals are not always the same thing, and therefore it might be safe to surmise that they're not at all the same thing.
Well, no, it's going to be two completely different things, because what I'm talking about is the way that the authors of these studies that are trying to look at differences between men and women pragmatically are using the term. And the only way that it has utility, and the default way that everyone without batting an eye understands when they say there is a difference between arrest rates or labor rates or finance rates, etc., we all understand that implicitly, without a question, that that's talking about men are biological males, women are biological females. We all understand that. It would not be pragmatic to do any sort of study like this if the definition of man and woman was how do the people self-identify. It would be impossible to do those studies and they would lose all utility. And language is important because we need to have these categorizations so we could find the most close path to objective truth in the real world. If these languages are self-subjective, then it loses all meaning and any sort of study like that would be irrelevant. You can't give one example. Then you say, oh, but I can ask you things that you wouldn't give an example of. And the study—
That's just wrong. I have plenty of examples. I mentioned one study already.
Please. Then when you say, I can name things that you can't ask, can you say that there are people that 100% say that a study that shows 100% of people identifies their genitalia? It's irrelevant. No, I will completely concede that there are plenty of people that don't identify with what their biological sex is. So, doesn't change the different definition of man and woman. That means that they have some sort of mental or physical illness that we should talk about. Just like we wouldn't say, well, a person that has multiple voices in their head, we now have to say that humans have multiple voices. It could be 1 through 4, and we have to change the language of what we're talking about when we talk about humans. Elsewise, it erases people that are schizophrenic. It's nonsensical. Yes, there are clearly people that can identify however they want. Similarly, I could say to you, I identify as a thin, tall, muscular man, right? And if you would say, okay, what do those words mean? We'll say tall, muscular man, right? You would say, well, this is what tall, muscular man means. And I'd say, can you show me a study that 100% that only tall, muscular men identify as tall, muscular men? Oh, you can't? Then that means that the definition of tall and muscular is inaccurate, and therefore we must change it. Quickly, you could see how all language then becomes meaningless because the words just become subjective, and when we use any descriptive term, it's completely irrelevant because all the descriptive term will ever mean is what I myself claim that those things mean.
And let me interrupt for just a moment, Mel, before you respond. I do want to point out you both are taking long time frames to kind of spit out. I'm allowing it because you're both doing it, and I'm okay with it. As long as we are not interrupting and it's pretty equalized, you are very balanced on the as far as the mic is concerned. So continue on. Mel, to you.
I'm personally okay with interjecting if I say something wrong about your claims or something like that, because I don't want to be wrong about your claims. I do have a long response again.
That's fine.
So you said, sorry. So first of all, you said I had no studies that I posted. I posted a link in this side. Again, it's called What is Gender Anyways? Let me get back to the top so I get that right. A review of the options for operationalizing gender. Now I have to get back to the part I highlighted. Oh, and did I mess that up? Yes, I did. Very good. Basically, God damn it. And I tried to copy and paste it in the side too. So I just need a moment to find that section again.
As you look for that, I'll just say quickly, as you look for that, that is not the sort of study that I was talking about. Yes, there are academics that are sort of
talks about, no, it is because it literally talks about the importance of doing what you're talking about, the utility of having gender.
Okay. That could be fine. It could say that. I'm asking you to provide me a study that talked about pragmatic outcome differences between men and women that use gender in the self-subjective way that you're claiming that we should. Show me one study.
It's not proof of anything that I can't come up with something for your narrow conditions. Now, I'm not done responding yet, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to read the spot I lost because I totally lost it. I'm going to try reading this. Response is possible to categorize. I'll try to come back with that. But I think that it's interesting that you're trying to do this. You have no studies saying, because I clearly do. When you have no necessary condition for what a man or woman is that is purely biological, I have one. Asking somebody, if somebody tells you that, like, I identify this way, that's a very good condition for somebody committing to that, because someone who's committed to that gender and performing that gender over their lives will definitely and confidently say what they are. So is there any biological factor that you could think of that is a necessary condition for man or woman?
Yes, the necessary condition for how we use the term man and woman is man is a biological adult male and woman is a biological adult female.
So
if you're a biological male and you say I'm a woman, you are wrong.
So And by that you mean gametes, the production of gametes.
Sure, we could say gametes, though I will admit that sometimes on the fringes there can be exceptions to the rule. Some people might look at it purely as genitals, so having a penis doesn't matter. Exceptions don't prove. We still, for example, any sort of categorization is going to have exceptions. For example, we could say humans are beings that have 2 arms, 2 legs, and 23 chromosomes, right? And yet you could find humans that through mutations and other such things don't have that. That doesn't change the fact that the descriptor that has utility and the way language works is humans are beings with 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and 23 chromosomes. The exception doesn't prove that that's the rule. It's a disorder. It's an illness. And therefore, by definition, it doesn't disprove the actual definition. It just proves that everything is able to have exceptions to the rule, particularly if we describe them as things that are outside of sort of the norm of what those things are.
So when you say that there are exceptions to the rule, but then you also say that it's a mental illness, you kind of make it seem like it's not naturally occurring. I would argue it is actually. In fact, we see this not just in humans, but that the bimodal distribution of sex characteristics, and I'm not even talking about gender yet, the bimodal distribution of sex characteristics inherently, statistically account for the possibility of some differences in sexual development.
Of course, no one would
disorders.
disagree with that. Let me ask a question to see if I can understand, sort of get to more of what you're talking about. I'm trying to steel man your position here. So you're saying that there is some connection to our sort of sexual reproduction with the concept of gender. Can you explain what that is just briefly?
Yeah, so these things are interconnected. Really, the interconnection that makes them observable would be like a historical connection where, like back in agrarian times, the way we divided labor between men working in the fields and women working in the home did make a lot of sense. But we have lost a need for those categories, especially today. And what that's kind of shown us is that there's, and sorry if I'm losing track, I'm also trying to find something, that there's more of a overlap than difference between these groups, which is actually why it makes sense that gender itself is also a spectrum.
Okay, can you define it? I promise I'm going somewhere with this. Can you define the term transgender?
People who are transgender are people who are born or exist, because born is still debatable, but exist with a gender identity that does not conform with their genitalia.
Okay, so for example, this would be someone who is born as a biological male, but then as they get older, their identity is, I'm not a biological male. I am the opposite of that.
No, well, no. And in fact, most trans people are aware of acknowledging their reproductive capability. I can't say all because I don't know them all, but most are. I've never met one who hasn't, in fact. And that's because, like, if you're a trans man, you got to realize that you can get pregnant. Like, that's sexual health. And so, you'll probably meet most leftist debaters who will point out trans men can get pregnant, trans women cannot. And that's acknowledging the biological reality right there.
So just to be clear, a trans man, by the way, I'm not saying this to be rude. I always screw this up. A trans man is a biological female that identifies as a man. Is that correct?
Female to male is the best way to think about it. And the only reason we call it that is because that is a colloquial usage. It's not a scientific usage.
So there's utility in understanding that there was a biological reality to your sex, but there is an incongruence and you represent or self-identify as sort of the other sex. Fair? With
the same gender that the other sex does, yeah.
And so that's
because again, these are schemas.
Sure.
And so schemas are representations of the mind. They're not like physically grounded.
That's the definition. Can you tell me how many genders there are?
Not off my hand. I heard 22.
22 genders. How can we come to that label? What if someone comes up tomorrow and says, actually, I identify as something different? Would you then accept that's a 23rd?
So first of all, I'm gonna have to answer. I'd love to give a linear algebra example with like matrices and stuff, but I don't have Paint up in the right way and to screen share it. But the basic way of putting it is that since this is a spectrum, first of all, it's not binary, and so it's possible to be both or neither. And since there's even some interplaying between and extrinsic categories from just that narrow definition I just gave, you get a lot of diversity there. It's essentially saying that, like, another way of thinking about it, actually, here, let me try to put this in a way that it's more conversational. We lose the need for these things once the actual, like, biological origin of these things start to disappear and we evolve and grow as a species. So then people can play more with their forms of gender expression and then come up with like what that means to them. I'll be honest. 90% of these you won't encounter in the wild.
Okay, well, that's sort of irrelevant when your argument is the exception proves that the rule can't exist, because there's people that it's sort of a bimodal sort of, so there are people that are intersex, therefore we can't say that biological men are blah, blah, blah. So saying that 90% chance you won't encounter, it's irrelevant. Can you name me just 2 or 3 of the other genders other than sort of man, woman?
Sure. So gender non-conforming, bigender, there is an intersex gender where people actually just say I'm intersex and I'm okay with that.
I'm Zer. What's that called? What's my gender if I'm Zer?
That's a set of pronouns.
Okay, but what gender would that represent?
That's used to differentiate themselves from traditional uses of gender.
Okay, so given that, whatever that defined term would be, someone who identifies as the gender that differentiates themselves from traditional concepts of gender. You've already said that gender is intrinsically tied at some level to sex. So
not intrinsically, it's interconnected.
It's interconnected. So what's the interconnection? So given that, no doubt at least one of those genders will have to do with something that's not just both genders, non-genders, not identifying as gender. So those genders that are outside the scope of that, either agreeing with the predefined genders that we already have based on biological reality or existing intentionally, definitionally outside of that scope, those that are identifying as a third gender or any sort of gender that's outside of being defined by those first 2 genders, what's the biological connection to sex for them? So for example, a Z-Zer person, what are they transgendering from and to? Right? Because if you, as a transgender person or someone that was a biological male who doesn't identify to that, and there is some sort of interconnectedness to sex on the term gender, so now you're connecting to female, what is the sex that there's interconnection to a Z-Zer?
So as I've pointed out, these definitions often stem from like traditional interconnections that we don't even really see a need for anymore. And so when I say that these are non-traditional kind of identities, what I'm saying is like these people are creating an identity that's completely independent of their sex rather than trying to uphold like traditional binary sex categories.
So then you would say that sometimes gender has an interconnection to sex. For example, a female to male transition has an interconnection nature to sex by definition because they don't express themselves in the same, identify biologically as male, therefore they're female. Yet other genders are the complete opposite of that in that there is zero connection to sex whatsoever.
Well, it might help to be specific because it's like the ways that it connects is specifically in the gender roles. Someone's sorry, 1 second. Someone's internal gender identity, that being subjective as it is, can happen either dependently or independently of those traditional sex interconnected roles. So again, gender can still happen independently of its connections to sex.
See, already we could see that not only is the definition that you're giving self-referential and subjective, which destroys all utility, but even the characteristics of which you define it does, and we'll get to that in a second, but even the characteristic of which you define it are malleable even in the incredible opposite direction. There is interconnection to sex. There's no interconnection to sex with others. The other point I want to ask on this point before we get to the self-referential portion of this is, how would it be that someone is transgender? How do you know? And I don't want to make this personal, I promise, but I think that it would be easier to ask, are you transgender? Is that fair? Do you mind answering that question?
Yeah, can I actually respond to some things you said real quick?
Sure, why not? Then we'll get back to this.
So first of all, gender has always been malleable, and the definition has been debated for a while. Thus showing that it was never really set in stone to begin with. I think you're also confusing potentiality and actuality. So would you consider gender, or let's start with sex. Would you consider sex to be a potentiality or an actuality? Just someone's sex, not actually reproducing.
I think it's actual.
And gender would be an actuality or a potentiality.
Yes, it is a grammatical category in the way that we talk that has to do with the biological reality of being male or female.
So you think that's an actuality as well?
Yes.
So how come people aren't born as man or woman?
Because the definition of man, which is a quote gender category, is adult male.
Right. So when someone comes into this world, there would have to be a formal cause that makes it an actuality. Otherwise, it's a potentiality.
Well, but
there's
the definition
to it.
It's an absurd distinction, right? It's trying to use sort of semantics.
No, it's not.
It is because right.
This is the distinction that led to This is the distinction that led to the Catholic Church admitting in what is it again? The thing with the body of Christ where they're like transfiguration, transcendentalism, I forget. But like basically this is such a powerful argument because here's the thing, right? If the categories that you're creating for sex don't actually tell us about gender, then they can't actually move it. And using those categories as a study for humanity as a whole bastardizes the whole point of studying humanities to begin with, which is to understand us, to understand us more, not less.
This is so absurd because all I'm saying is that the concept of gender is just the way that grammatically we categorize based on biological reality or sex. Within that, we could have definitions of specific terms that we use in that grammatical category that could be hyper specific to types of male and types of female. For example, if I say an elderly man, you can't say, oh, well, elderly man's sort of a bad definition because you can't be born an elderly man. Therefore, we can't consider that an actual definition. That's absurd because the definition includes the part about age. The same would be true of man and woman. It is adult male or adult female. You are born a boy, which is a non-adult male, or a girl, which is a non-adult female. That's so the idea that just because you're not born a man, which by definition, man has a portion of it that has to do with age, is absurd to say that it's not actualized.
So I think you don't kind of understand the point that you're making about causes. You're kind of making a cause from form, like this actually kind of exists in some sort of platonic hyperspace, rather than it being something that actually makes sense. Gender is not something that we're born with. Just having a certain sex doesn't automatically lead to gender being expressed one way or another. What we see is that humans create that, is that cultures create that, and that this varies incredibly across these things. And the reason for that is that even though sex, the statistics of sex are very much the same, when humans make stuff up, then definitions automatically kind of become circular because it's a man-made thing, and B, it becomes malleable because you can have different populations that come up with different definitions of things. And that malleability is actually proof to my point that there is no such thing as real objective gender. There is only gender as we perceive it. Now, going back to the causes
wait.
Aristotle.
First up, please, let me go before you go to
I let you ramble.
Please,
so
before you go on to another point, you do.
I've
been so patient.
Hold on. Here's what I'll say, Furby. Here's what I'll say, because you did say I do want to be corrected if I misrepresented something that you said.
That's true.
And you offered that, so I will allow it only because you
reminding me.
offered that. Okay.
So just to be clear, this was an interjection on the question I asked you about being trans, and we went down a path that you wanted, right? So just to be clear, that's how we ended in this spot. You're sort of begging the question there with your response. The question, I'm fundamentally disagreeing with your definition of gender, and you say, well, Rob, your definition can't be correct, and then you proceed to say the reason it can't be correct is because your definition is correct, but that's circular. No, I don't believe that you have to self-identify, and that's what gender means. I believe that gender is a grammatical categorization of biological realities of sex. And so, yes, you can be born a gender. You fundamentally are arguing that no, actually, it has to do with the way you identify, and therefore you won't know how you identify when you're an infant. I disagree with that, and I think I'm doing a tremendous job arguing why not only is it the reality that anytime this term's used with utility, we're talking about it in biological sex and being a categorical expression of that, but the only time that it's not used in that way are by people that are trying to have cultural inroads through sort of this queer theory in order to subvert language to interchange the words to achieve political and cultural outcomes.
Well, I can think of other things like people who actually have trans kids. I just want to point out, like, the definitions I'm giving are actually observable. So the differences in gender across culture, I can post you studies about this. This comes down to the local level, these changes. And like I said,
so it's observable. Is Sarah a man or a woman?
Sarah, let me ask Sarah something for a second. Before you do, Sarah, you're a country girl, right?
I'm both.
Oh,
I've been
okay.
in both. Yeah.
Do you see a difference in how men in the country versus men in the city act?
I mean, you could go with accents and things that, like, hobbies are differing for the most part.
Are men in the city more likely to be feminine? It's like maybe a better way of putting that question. Sorry to narrow it.
No, not the ones I know.
Oh, okay. I've met a lot of people who disagree, but sorry, I just thought maybe you would observe that too. And Rob was asking you, or were you asking me if she's a woman, or you were
Yes.
asking her?
Now I'm
Oh,
asking you. You said it's observable. So am I a man or a woman? Is Sarah a man or a woman? Or are we some other third gender?
that's not what I said was observable,
Then
Rob.
what's
What I
observable?
said was observable is how we handle gender, how we define gender.
Right. You're right. How anybody defines anything is observable. Can you think of one term that the way someone identifies isn't it observable of how they identify? Can you think of one term that doesn't fit that
In
categorization?
terms of internal, not offhand, because
Right.
I
So
want to
then
make a
you
different
basically,
argument anyways.
so your argument here is basically, well, because it's observable how I define gender, therefore that gives it some form of legitimacy. Absurd. Every term fits that category.
Well, you're also sort of saying that just because things have some overlap, that we should also consider them to be the same thing. So, like, if you want to get to absurdity, like neither of us are free of that guilt, and so that's a very poor argument. What I will say is that I think that if you went out into the world, if you took like maybe several gender studies courses, talked to some actual gender studies professors, maybe even if you got the chance, talk to Judith Butler, that would be amazing. On these things, what you'd hear is that there is no universal definition of gender. There is no definition that if we wipe all of our brains clean, that tomorrow everyone's going to wake up, all the women are going to start wearing makeup on their own, all the men are going to start wearing loose fitting jeans and stuff like that. Some of these things are convenience, but when you think about it, like there's nothing about having a penis that stops you from wearing a dress. There's some inconveniences, but there's literally like there's not it's not like the penis says warning cannot be worn with a dress without catastrophic consequences.
Okay,
Can I
but
ask
it's
a
sort of
clarifying question to that? Don't we call that like drag? If a man wears a dress, it's not transgender, right? I just want to make sure
if they still identify as a man.
So if I may, right, I think that it's glib in how you're sort of approaching this and saying, well, it can be benign. Just because a man wears a dress doesn't mean that you have to do X, Y, Z. Yes, but there's clearly subversion when it comes to controlling language. And even Judith Butler and company would admit that. He who controls the language will be able to subvert in many ways. Let me tell you an example. You asked me to take gender studies courses. Not only have I debated some of the premier gender studies debaters that occurred in the country back when I used to debate many moons ago, but I took a lot of these courses to try to get some understanding of it. So let me tell you one of the courses I took. One day, an issue came up that talked about the difference. It said there are studies. The reason that we see a disparity on women getting custody of children in divorces more than men is because there are many studies that talk about raising children in a feminine household is better than raising them in a masculine household. So I raised my hand and said, can you define the traits of what this study means when it says feminine and masculine? She says, yes, feminine is caring, nurturing, providing support, feeding on time, those sorts of things. Masculine would be beating your child, starving them. And I was like, so in other words, the study says raising kids good is good and raising them bad is bad. It just affixes the terms masculine and feminine. And she argued with me. And I said, are you saying that biological males are less likely to be better caretakers than biological females? She says, perish the thought. I wouldn't say that. And then immediately goes back to explaining why biological men should be less likely to get custody of children. What happened was a subversion of the language by interchanging what we mean by man and woman and sometimes saying that it's just a self-identification category. And then when it fits you to say, actually, no, when we're talking about sort of disparities that prioritize the victimhood group, in this case, women, we'll actually talk about the sexual differences and say there's a sexual connotation. That's what I'm talking about of subverting language and sorting to create activism, which ended up leading to a lot of the outcomes. We could talk about these outcomes of sort of what I see as sort of perverse nature and degeneracy that's occurred because of things like this idea of transgenderism. But I want to get back to the question that I asked you because
I have a bunch of stuff to
I'm sure you do, but I would like to get back to the question. I just want to ask you, do you identify as transgender? Because I have a point that I would like to ask you about this.
Okay, I will answer that at the end of what I say, so that way you can. So subversion can happen for a reason, particularly when things are wrong and people are able to point out that there is something like an injustice or even a categorical error, which we agree are harmful, which is why I'm arguing to avoid them. And yes, I am transgender.
Okay, how do you know you're transgender?
Because I feel like I'm living a lie, like a literal lie, by pretending to be a man.
Okay, but how do you know you're not just a woman as opposed to a transgender woman?
What do you mean just a woman?
Like, why do you affix the descriptive term transgender? Why aren't you just a woman?
Oh, no. Transgender women and cisgender women are both women.
Okay, but my question is, why are you not a cisgender woman? Why are you transgender woman?
Well, because I'm not a woman on a reproductive level.
Oh, so woman, why? So explain to me the connection again between the reproductive level of woman and how that goes with the term that you define as gender, which is woman.
So when someone is a cisgendered woman, their reproductive function matches their identity. When someone is a transgender woman, their reproduction function can be different than their gender identity.
But can you define what a woman is for me? To you, I know that it's the characteristics of a woman. So can you tell me what those characteristics are that make you want to call yourself a woman?
So depending on what culture you're in, women can
your culture, you specifically, I mean, that's what I'm asking you.
Oh, my culture.
Yes.
I mean, no, that's a little kind of hard because, like I said, it can even vary locally. But
you're you, so you know how you.
I thought you wanted a one. First of all, like, okay, so women here present as very feminine. They often wear a lot of makeup. They
define feminine.
Define feminine.
Yes, you're defining woman as someone who acts feminine. My understanding is feminine by definition.
Can you define red for me?
Let me finish.
Well, let's run the line of logic. Yeah. Let Rob run the line of logic, and then Mel, if you want to return one as well, we'll do that.
I
have to return it on him because like it's fundamentally impossible for him to define red the same way it's fundamentally impossible for me to define qualia like feminist, like.
I think I would find it to be productive if we run through either the yes or no or how you define something, because we have been laying in semantics pretty hard tonight, I think, and I'd like it to at least establish kind of the foundation of where you're going with the conversation.
My only contention with that is I've already asked Rob what the necessary conditions for a woman is, and he still hasn't given me any that actually work. It's a qualia. It actually has no objective definition. I don't think it means much. From an artistic standpoint, sure. No, that's not my first definition. That's not my first definition. So this definition varies heavily based on what a cultural schema for women is, right? So first you have to know that information before you can actually define what women is in any given place. But then the definition would be someone who follows that schema accordingly so they can fit in with the group they feel they belong to.
Okay, but you're making a broad categorization. You're like, well, it could be different place to place.
Women is a broad categorization.
By the way,
Rob.
Can I real quick? It's just a technical issue. You guys can hear me all right? Can my audience hear me? The question, I think I accidentally muted my mic on mine, so I'm just going to repeat this real quick. My audience didn't.
You're okay on ours. Your chat saying it's fixed.
Okay, so the question that I asked you was, I think that feminine, if it's true that feminine is just the characteristics of women, and I ask you to define how you subjectively define woman, and you say feminine, you've basically just I define women as people with the characteristics of women. And then your answer about this schema thing, yes, you might be right in a broad categorizational, but when your definition is the subjective belief of an individual, and you're like, yes, but each culture, each woman within that category could subjectively believe woman is something different. I'm erasing all of that by asking you yourself, who identifies as a woman, who admits that the definition of woman has to do with exhibiting the characteristics that we traditionally think that a woman would. How do you define woman? What are the characteristics that you think are women? Not some woman in Swahili, not some woman in France, you yourself. So it's not sufficient to say, well, actually, women in different areas can identify it differently. I'm asking you, how do you know you're a woman if your definition of woman is exhibiting the characteristics of what we commonly assume as women? I'm asking you, well, what are those characteristics for you, not hypothetically for other people?
Yeah, so I've grown up in this world. And you asked for me, so I'm giving you a very personal answer. Sure. I grew up in this world wanting to be, and this is a quote, quote, like her, right? And so I would see what women do, and I would think that feels like the category I should be in. So I want to be like that. That's my intrinsic identity. And so I started orienting my behaviors and stuff up to a point, a very particular point in my life, that would have been deemed more feminine, because I felt like women were the group I belonged to and not men. I also didn't really question it prior to that point. So there wasn't like, I'm doing this to rebel or something like that. It was literally just like, I don't necessarily feel like a boy. And since I'm not being pushed heavily into one category or another, I don't feel like a girl either. I'm just being myself, kind of.
But
and then
you understand how that definition, if I'm legitimate, and by the way,
well, you asked me about my personal gender history.
Right.
That's inherently not a definition.
Listen, but when you say that the definition of woman, it has to do with the characteristics of women, and you say, and I am a woman, and I ask schema. You, and I like whatever, then your schema of women is, I ask, what's that schema that you have? And you're like, I just always identified as her. That's not definitional to any of us. I'm telling you, your answer here is proof why you're incorrect.
I didn't realize you were asking me what my specific schema was.
Let me finish, right? Your answer here is proof how your definition of this is so useless.
I think you need to ask your questions better, buddy.
Please, let me finish my point,
like,
please.
Hold on.
You're complaining about how I answered the question, but you didn't answer the question right to begin with.
He's not. I see what he's saying. He's basically saying like what you're saying is, well, I represent myself this way, X, Y, Z. Really doesn't have any definitive answer that we can put into an equation or something.
If I can real quick, give me 10 seconds to explain this. Your definition is useless because right now, everyone listening still has no idea why you identify as a woman. They have no idea, which shows that there is zero utility, because everyone's sitting, I'm trying to honestly hear from you. I'm not coming at this from a stance of like, I want to make fun of you. I'm like, how do you know you're a woman? And you're like, because I identify as her. And now you're like, well, I didn't know you were asking for my individual schema. I could not have made it more clear at least 3 times. I'm not asking about women in Swahili. I'm asking about you.
You didn't say schema. So in terms of my particular schema, I was thinking long hair, wearing makeup, wearing flowery, pretty clothes, being a little quieter, a little bit more demure and stuff like that, being more agreeable, making eye contact more, smiling more, a lot of the things that can be a little bit broader. But here's the thing is, I don't consider my own definition to be sufficient. I don't think anybody's individual definition is sufficient for something that is inherently a broad category. And yes, I gave you a definition of a broad category. I still feel kind of unsatisfied because I think you're just doing this all to deflect from having to answer what is a necessary condition for a woman on your end that isn't just biological.
You ready?
Yeah.
The necessary condition is being an adult biological female.
So what is a female?
A female is someone with large gametes production.
So if someone does not produce large gametes, and this is a condition that females can have, are they no longer a woman? No, then that's not a necessary condition, Rob. No, that's not true, because we could have every definition for any specific term, particularly when we're talking about biological life, will always have exceptions. That does not disprove that the definition has utility and is true. For example, how many chromosomes do humans have? But then if you can have a definition that doesn't rely on that, that's fine. I asked you a question, can you answer? How many chromosomes do humans have? I'm rebutting now because I'm the one leading the line of questioning now. You can have something that doesn't fit the definition, and all that means is that that's not a necessary condition for it. It's a possible condition, but not a necessary condition. I'm asking you for one thing that there's from women that if it's not a woman, then they're no longer a woman. What is it? If they're not a biological adult female. But you've already reduced that down to their haploid. How many now, I went through your line of questioning. You just admitted that it got circular. How many chromosomes do a human have? Rob, do you concede that there is no necessary condition for a woman? Do you concede that there's no necessary condition for a woman? I will repeat my answer for you one more time, and then I would appreciate. I see the point coming. I see the point coming. I think it would be better to answer. It is a simple question. Go ahead. Okay, ask it again. How many chromosomes does a human have? 23. But wait, there can't be humans without 23 chromosomes? No, because, well, no, there can actually, because they just wouldn't be reproductively compatible. So then but we still might call them, wait, Rob, will we still call them man or woman?
It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to the question. I'm controlling the line of questioning now, so I'd appreciate if you answer. So given that, if now you're changing your definition, then can you give me a necessary condition of how many chromosomes a human has?
No, sorry, that's not a change in definition.
Sure it is. You at first said they have 23, and then you said, please, let me finish. Please, let me finish.
We created a new term for that difference. No, I'm not done. I'm not done. I'm not done.
Hold on. I see where the point's going, and I want to see it finish. And then, Rob, after you finish through that little walkthrough,
Sure.
Then we're going to turn it over to Mel, okay?
That's fair. When I asked you, you gave a definitive answer, 23 chromosomes. When I said, but what about a human that doesn't have 23? You said, you changed, and you said, oh, yes, there can be humans without 23. The point that I'm trying to make is quite simply, yes, there can be abnormalities, but that doesn't prove that the realities of what the norm for human biology is, just like the norm for any biology of any living being, can't be discussed because there could be abnormalities that occur through within that. And my definition is always going to have far more necessary conditions because your definition is always going to be subjective. For example,
none of those necessary conditions seem sufficient.
That's okay. So you give me the next, then again, you would understand that for all sorts of reasons, it would be important to be able to scientifically describe the makeup of a human, correct?
I don't think we can describe it with a high degree of precision.
But nonetheless, it would be important to define terms to actually attempt to know as much as about. Okay, so given that, can you give me the necessary condition for chromosomes for a human being?
Necessary condition for chromosomes for a human being?
Yes.
Not offhand, actually, because I'm not that familiar with the human genome in particular.
So, I'll finish. I promise this is the last word on it, and then you could control the questioning. So you could see that the stylistic way that you're arguing and saying that all language is malleable and there's always exceptions to the rule, therefore we can't say that there's ever a necessary. That's the logical implication of what you're saying. Therefore, we can't say that there are necessary conditions for anything. It makes language a total social construct, and it defeats the utility of language.
No, it's not all language. So first of all,
give me an example of any necessary condition of human.
This is for gender in specific. Rob, the thing that we did once we realized that not all human chromosomes were 46 XX or XY was we created up a new term, right? We created up something called karyotypes, and the word karyotypes is kind of like the word gender, in that there is no such thing as a mandatory set of karyotypes. Just because karyotypes as an idea and the concept exists doesn't mean that the bimodal distribution of our chromosomes aren't 46 XX or XY. We still need terminology that can factor in these differences. Otherwise, we're just ignoring this and having imprecise language. So again, I'm asking you to either concede or find me a necessary condition that without it, we no longer have a man or a woman.
You proved my point. Thank you so much. Yes, what we did was we created new terms to define the abnormality, which is exactly what we should do with the concept of gender, which in a historical connotation meant the grammatical category of male
Rob,
and female.
do you have a karyotype?
Please, let me finish. So given that, we should have created new terms like
no, that's not what we did with karyotypes, though. You're just wrong. Rob, why do you want to be wrong about this?
Hold on.
I will give you, Mel, I will cede the floor and you could tell me how I'm incorrect about this. Go ahead,
Mel.
I thought you meant after you finish. Sure. Even if you have a normal karyotype, you still consider to have a karyotype. This isn't something that's
define karyotype.
Karyotypes are the count of chromosomes that can exist for a given group. So for humans, we don't just have 46XX or 46XY. You can have 45 or 47, or you can have 46XXX or 46XXY. There's many different combinations possible because nothing in nature is absolute, or almost nothing in nature is absolute.
And so we created a new term to identify the fact that there could be significant abnormalities, and so nothing is absolute. And so there could be a broad range. In fact, even if there's never been an experience identified identified of a human being having something like 17 chromosomes, hypothetically it's possible. So we defined this term, which I've never heard of before, but we created it, that says, well, wait a minute, there could always be exceptions to the rules, so we need to have a term that describes that. We created
its utility,
let me
least,
finish.
right?
We created a new term, the same way that we should have done, such as gender dysmorphic or people with mental illnesses that don't identify correctly with the biological reality that they exhibit. Yes, we should have created new terms instead of subverting language, and you've already conceded that
It's not subverting
historically, the
language.
way that this has been used, again, you can't provide one study that talked about the pragmatic difference in outcomes between men and women, not one ever that you're able to cite.
I can give you one for
that is-
karyotyping. Actually, karyotyping
What does
is
it
a
have to
great
do with the question that I just asked?
that when we came up with a new word, there was a utility for it, which is the only time we ever make these words. So again, with karyotyping, actually being able to do fertility studies on people, that was an important thing about understanding why some people are infertile. Going back to the trans stuff, we're not trying to redefine sex. Sex is the objective category. Sex is the thing that actually happens. It's a real thing. Gender is something that occurs in the mind. It is a representative schema and enacted behaviors. You are your sex. You can only do gender.
That's untrue. Again, you're saying that I'm right because I'm right, and therefore I'm
No,
right.
I'm
It's
not. I'm telling you the difference
I'm
between
telling
these
you, I'm
things.
telling you that I disagree, as have humans throughout most of human history, and in all ways that there is utility.
And
when
those
they use
people
their-
were wrong
Please,
for a
let me
long
finish.
period of time.
Please.
No,
Okay.
Rob, that came before we had any scientific knowledge on things.
Okay, so explain
Seriously.
that it's absurd because it's just a change in definition of a term that's already existed. You just admitted when it came to chromosomal differences, we created new terms to be more specific. Your argument is that we were forced to change the term gender to now about identity, which it never was previously.
I never
until
argued
basically-
we were forced to.
Yeah, well,
for
we
one
should.
thing.
All right, we should. Which previous to that, it had nothing to do with identity, but we should change. Else, we'd be erasing people. But you've already given the solution to your problem. We could create new terms, therefore those people wouldn't be erased. I again show you that I'm
gender is the
obviously
new term.
real quick. I again show you that I'm obviously correct because in any study that you could think of that talks about pragmatic differences in outcomes between men and women, which is how we'll use this term to have like real utility in the real world, such as difference in pay gap between men and women. Every single time that you could think of, it's not discussing how these people self-identify. It's discussing the biological reality of them being adult males or adult females. You can't give one example, which
Yes,
proves
I
that
already
you were
did.
wrong. Yeah, and I just want to say, this proves you are wrong on the descriptive claim of what is, because the majority of people that use this term in all ways that it's utility are using it as a grammatical category of an extension of sex. And we could get to the ought if you want, why it's not only that way, but it ought to be that way.
So again, I can already point to a study that literally talks about why we should do this. So you keep saying like it's not being done, it's not talked about in literature, blah blah blah. It is. And John Money, as much as I hate some of the research he did do that. In fact, John Money used to be just like just an environmentalist and say like, oh, it's all just environmental. Nobody has any like intrinsic inclinations. He later realized like, no, we actually have our own intrinsic inclinations to be a part of a group.
What does the
to
word-
look at one group or another and say that's the group I want to be a part of, and the reasons, and we don't have a word for that in particular because there's no reason for that word. The reason that we created the word gender is because when you walk on the street and you decide what pronouns to use and how to interact with somebody along lines of sexual differences, you don't actually look at their genitals. You don't look at any of that stuff. You look at presentation.
We didn't create the word gender to do that. The word gender existed long before it was defined as something as was identity. So no, that's not why we created the word gender.
words
That's
change
why
over time, Rob?
that's why certain people, for political and cultural reasons, tried to subvert language in doing that. But I get to this. If we're talking about erasure of people, let's go back to this example. I identify as tall. Correct or incorrect? Am I tall?
No, that is a measurable thing.
How is it measurable? What's the definition of tall?
With a ruler.
Okay, so how many inches do I have to be tall?
Oh, that's subjective.
Okay, so then if I say I'm tall because the definition is subjective, then you have to agree no matter how many inches I am, I'm tall, correct?
I mean, I can't disagree with your internal identity. I can disagree with you along other lines, like inductive arguments. Like I've seen a lot of people who are taller than you, so I wouldn't personally categorize you that
Right.
way.
And your biological reality is also objectively measurable. And you can think whatever you want in your own mind. And I can't control what you think of yourself in your own mind. You could be schizophrenic and hear voices in your head. And I have people in my life that I love. I work with people with disabilities who have issues like that. And I don't treat them like shit because they have voices in their head. They're welcome to think that the voices in their head are real. But you know what? I don't believe that those voices are real. Just like because it's measurable, we could determine if someone's tall or not, but they themselves could choose to characterize themselves as tall, even though everyone else in the world might say, no, you are objectively not tall. You're only 2'6". I can't control what individuals think, but I can control what the objective reality outside the scope of that is and how we use terms to be descriptive so we have a collective understanding of them. So you're welcome to think that you're a woman, but you're not.
Okay, so that was a really clever way of going out of our debate of the actual topic, is gender different from sex, which I've actually mostly heard concessions from you on,
I don't think you have.
into the trans stuff. Well, I'll address that in my conclusions, and you can respond accordingly. Just to point out, like, just because language recategorizes and changes over time, that doesn't always make it a subversion. When people are subverting norms, that's because they have a critique of those norms, and you have to actually identify if the critique is valid or not. I've been arguing this whole time the critique is valid, not only has merit but utility. But we can get into other stuff so that way we stop circling the drain.
No, I think this is good. Can you, like, real quick, maybe it would help each other, the moderator and the audience. Can you tell me, just in a nutshell, like a minute or two, what is the utility of gender being about self-identification? And then if you don't mind, I'll respond at what the utility is in my sense. And then we could go back and forth again, 2 minutes apiece, what the damage is for how the other person defines it.
Right. So the utility is that the best measure we have of somebody's own internal schema is actually to ask them. We have no better measurement. And so when we actually get this information from people, we might be able to make mostly psychological or sociological predictions about their behavior, the groups they might want to be a part of, and their gender history as well.
Okay. I think that the utility of defining gender in the way that it always was before this radical change was that it allows a grammatical categorization and words to be used that are descriptive of biological sex, and that's important for the utility in language. And it means that there is a universal understanding, with, granted, some things at the fringes that could be different. Like, for example, when I say cat, you might think of an image in your head that's slightly different than mine. I think of a big orange cat, you think of a big black cat, because we've each had cats or something like that. But we ultimately have an understanding, and all terms have utility based on each other being able to understand that terms. Language and definitions become meaningless if the terms are subjective. And so the downside of your claim is, or the way that you define gender is, because the term itself becomes self-referential, even the definition you give is basically, at the end of the day, man means people the way they think, act like men. It loses all utility because you may think men act a certain way and I may think they act different. So therefore, when you give the descriptive term, I am a man, that is a man, that is a woman, the word loses meaning because I say that could literally mean anything. If you were born in Africa, you will think that a man presents and has characteristics different than someone who was born in Los Angeles. And so when you say that is a man, I literally have no clue what that would mean. Once the word loses utility.
Wait, you said 2 minutes, right?
Did I go over 2 minutes? That's fine.
I might have started.
I may have gone over 2
late,
minutes. That's fine. Go ahead.
So, like, I agree with you. We need language to be functional. The difference is that, like, this is not something that is intrinsically real. We already have a word for biological sex. It's biological sex. For gender, though, what we need is something that identifies that not everybody who has a penis, for example, is going to want he, him pronouns. And understanding the difference between that, aside from, like, getting really into, like, the deep neurobiology of it and, like, the interactome, is to say, well, certain people are born into this world inclined to identify a certain way. and that inclination makes them want to be a part of a certain group. They look at what that group does, and then they emulate that behavior. And thus gender is an action. It is not something that you are, it is something that you do and you choose to do based on an inclination. You can also choose not to do it, right? You can subvert your own internal inclinations, but then somebody would change the gender they perform to do. They would no longer perform the same gender as if they didn't subvert it. So again, it all comes back down to that. And I'll just point out, like you said, like everything I'm doing is making things meaningless. I think conflation makes things especially meaningless, on top of the fact that you're actually the one doing a categorical error.
It's not a categorical error. Now, I'll re-explain what's going on here. The problem with what you're trying to say here is the problem you're trying to solve is easily solved by just creating new terms. Right? So we could create a new term that means someone that has a biological reality but identifies in a different way. I think the utility that would most come from defining those terms have to do with an idea that the word being defined means outside the scope of normal human experience. Like an illness, that would be a more accurate descriptor, so we could create new words that mean that. The problem is, you could redefine the term gender, but there are already words that exist within that scope of what gender is, such as man and woman. And what you've done is completely eliminate the utility of those words. And that's bad, because those words, seeing as how they were a grammatical categorization of biological reality, have utility. Now, I already talked about why in the studies, but let's give an example from a hypothetical that maybe you'll understand. Let's play a little role-playing scenario here, if you all don't mind. Sarah, Mel, would you care to join me on this journey? Mel, let's say that you're...
I don't know if I want to role play with you, Rob.
I assure you, it will be quite painless. Mel, let's say you're walking down the street and you have a...
Can you do this with Sarah?
Yeah, Sarah's going to be included in the example, right? The reason I'm using you as the aforementioned person is because I'm trying to be more diplomatic about the fact that you're trans and don't want to use you as the other part of this example.
Rob, okay, so first ask yourself, is this going to age well?
Yes. Ready? Okay. I think very much.
I'm being playful.
Just to be clear, I don't think that your ideas are aging well, as society's rejecting in wholesale this sort of completion.
Do I get a prize for playing along?
You do, which is the dignity of participating in such an epic debate. That's the prize you get. So, all right, now let's say you're walking down the street and you have a wallet, a purse, whatever you carry your money in. I don't give a shit, right? And Sarah, that thug that she is, glibly walks by you and grabs your purse, wallet, whatever, with all your money in it. And I happen to be a police officer, and I'm walking by, and you yell, "Officer, officer, someone just stole my purse." And Sarah's running down the street, but there's also like 20 other people on the street. And I say, "Who?" And you're like, "That person there." And you start to describe with blonde hair, maybe, I don't know how tall Sarah is, but let's say 5'8" or whatever, 5'6", whatever she is.
God.
And I say, "That man or woman." What are you going to say?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. I'll give you that much. So I'll take my time to answer it the best that I can. I think this depends heavily on how you want to identify that person. If that person's abnormally tall, then say they were really tall. If they had blonde hair, then say they had blonde hair. If you're going to say man or woman, I actually think their presentation matters more than what their gametes or hormones or stuff like that is. So you kind of prove my point with that. By the way, I didn't get a full chance to respond last time because your whole thing with wanting to role play.
I'll say take your time, Mel. But
I need a full rebuttal.
Figure it out. Figure it out.
Please, we could go. I want to stay on this example for a second. But as an officer, I just asked you, like, you start to describe blonde, 5'5", blah blah blah. And as an officer, I look and I see like 2 people that meet that description. And I have a limited amount of time to track down and get your money back. And I say, that man or that woman? What are you saying?
You use what you think the officer might identify. So if it's a trans woman and they've got a wig and a dress and makeup on, and you don't want to be to the officer like, it looked like a woman, but I think it might have also been a man. You just say that woman, so that way he'll go find the person in the fucking dress.
That's right.
But that's schema. That's again presentation. That's gender presentation. That's not biology. That's not biology. No, Rob. It has
nothing to do with schema.
Rob, is that biology?
Again,
is that biology? Yes or no?
I understand you realize you've disproven your whole argument here, and so now you're getting sort of frantic and spurging out a little. Cut back on the glibness just a bit here. No, what you've proven is when I'm being a little tongue in cheek. I'm not upset or anything. I know. But
You guys are fun.
But what I'm saying is, right, when the rubber meets the road and you need utility, the way that you know to define woman is exactly what other people will see as the characteristics of woman. You wouldn't say to the officer there, well, officer, wait a second. I can't tell you if it was a man or a woman because I did not get a chance to ask Sarah the mugger if she identifies as male or female. You understand that in that moment where it matters, and this term matters, that the utility in that term is saying the objective appearance and how people interpret what a man and woman is. You're absolutely correct that someone could look like a woman and not actually have the genitalia of a woman. But what this proves is that there is an objective reality. Your subjective view, let me finish. Your definition that relies on subjectively what each individual defines as themselves becomes completely irrelevant in every single situation where there is utility that requires the receiver of the communication you're giving to have some sort of understanding of what the term means. It will never have any utility.
But I need to be super clear on this. For one thing, like if this were a proof for like a biological woman, we'd see the logical argument. If their biology matters, then we would tell the officer about their gametes or their chromosomes or their genitals or something like that. But we don't. Therefore, it seems like biology doesn't matter. It seems like you're proving my point for me, buddy.
It's not true at all. There is an objective reality. There is
what do you mean it's not true at all? You just proved my point that we don't recognize those things. We recognize the length of their hair, whether or not they're wearing makeup or wearing a dress.
Right. The categories that we understand comes from the biological people that normally present us those.
Those words, those biological though.
They all have to do with phenotypical expressions of the biological reality. They all.
Gametes don't work. Gametes don't work.
Compare my definition to your definition, which would be that the definition of woman is people that act and present like a woman compared to their own individual definitions. That circular self-referential definition literally means nothing.
Sometimes definitions can be circular, so that's a fallacy to think that all circular definitions are like that. For example.
Sure.
For example, the color red, you can describe it on technical terms like its physical properties, but I cannot tell you what the color red looks like if you have never seen the color red. It is that simple. I can tell you all the other things that were red, but that doesn't mean I can tell you what red is. Just like the qualia of experiencing being a woman, I can't tell you that on a deep down level. I can tell you how I got here. I can't tell you what it's like. That's a much different thing. And so that's why these definitions become circular. When you demand a definition, then that's what you get. My question for you is, what is a necessary condition that's rooted in biology? Because I've already
adult human female. This is the 8th time you've asked adult human female
in a way that doesn't prove that.
Let me answer you again.
Condition.
Adult human female. Do you want to ask the question?
I've already proven that female is not sufficient as a necessary condition.
I disagree. We had this debate. We already talked about this. Yeah. You were unable to prove it. Just like with the chromosomal issue, you acknowledge that we still say that humans have a particular amount of chromosomes, and then we created another term to exemplify, yes, there could be abnormalities. But we haven't skirted
with other chromosomes.
We haven't skirted the definitional utility of saying that there is a utility because all language has to have utility that the receiver understands what's being discussed. And so the fact that
I not only responded to that directly, I posted something in the side that you can read all you like and try to refute that if you'd like. I think you need a necessary condition on this.
Necessary condition, adult human female. What's the necessary condition for women for you? What's the necessary condition for women for you?
That's not a sufficient condition because female can mean a lot of different things. Female can mean a lot of different things, and no singular thing about female.
I feel like that's become we're going back in circles again because I do believe we already tapped into all of this earlier. So we can continue it if you guys want to duke it out again. I'm happy to oblige.
If Rob can admit that he doesn't know what a necessary condition actually is,
I understand what a necessary
then
condition
you're unable to actually argue.
That's not true. What is the necessary condition for chromosomes that a human has? We're literally relitigating the argument that you've already lost. But if you need to relitigate it again, we can. What is the necessary condition for the amount of chromosomes that a human has?
Since we relitigate this, I'll jump to the chase. We still call the people with different chromosomes human, just like we still call the people who don't have those certain conditions female, right? Because there is no such thing as a necessary condition.
That is true. So there can be, for example, It's basically true, right? We say that there are abnormalities, but people would still exist within these categorizations. So, for example, we can say that if the biological reality made someone closer to the biological sex of female, even though they might not meet the necessary conditions of what we consider female, which is biological sex, that we would still say that we would categorize them as female because it's closer to that. I could demonstrate this easily if you want. What is you say necessary condition for woman? How about this? What's the necessary condition for female?
So necessary condition, there is no singular necessary condition. There are a bunch of conditions that together increasingly point to someone being female. Now, reproductively.
No, wait.
Now, no, do you want the answer?
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
let her answer.
Now, there's a more narrow reproductive definition that doesn't apply to humans in particular, and that is the production of large and small gametes. But I will point out that even if someone is not able to produce gametes, we still call them women. So that necessary condition for female does not go all the way to gender. It does not extrapolate to gender.
Do we still call them female? I noticed the clever sleight of hand there.
Actually.
Oh, so
yes,
so it's just to be clear, if the other characteristics that would make up what we consider female exist within a person, but they have some sort of abnormality where they're incapable of producing large gametes, you would say that they're still female.
I'm saying my general point, by the way, is that
was a
without
simple
a
yes,
necessary condition, you can't say that there's any biological essentialist argument for gender.
I didn't hear a yes, no, an answer to my question.
That's fine.
Would you like me to
repeat? I think
repeat
you're losing track of what my argument is, which is specifically that we need this necessary condition to make any biological essentialist argument.
I noticed
without
once
it,
more.
You can still have female and woman interchangeably.
Why are you incapable of answering the question? I'll get to the utility of why I'm asking this question. I'll ask again. If someone met all the conditions biologically of what we consider female, with the exception that they had some sort of abnormality where they didn't have the correct gamete production, would we still call them a female?
Yes, because these so-called abnormalities are naturally occurring. Therefore, we don't need to uncategorize them as like some different group, except for when we're making those distinctions. So the same for transgender versus cisgender woman. Sometimes we're just talking about that woman over there, and it doesn't really matter if they're trans or not. But if I were talking about a trans issue, like trans rights, and how that differs from the rights of other women, like cisgender women, then we might want to be able to make those distinctions every time I say woman, right?
You just defeated your own argument because by proving that there are no, quote, necessary conditions that would be applicable to all definitions of female, and yet we could still look at biological reality in determining who's a female, even if there are abnormalities. Then when we go over to the term woman, when I say as an adult human female, you say you can't use that because you can't give a necessary condition. Yet you would defeat your own argument based on your argumentation. Then we could never call anyone a female because we don't have an exact definition with complete necessary conditions. Once you say that we can make exceptions for the term female, and my definition of woman includes adult human or is adult human female, you don't get to say that that definition can't apply because it falls victim to the very things that you're saying that are acceptable with the term female. You've defeated your own argument.
If women were something like comparable to height, for example, that we could measure, there would be necessary conditions within the category, within the definition of woman, that we could also measure.
Like what?
When this conflicts with how society uses things, then when you're doing something more than just biology or genetics, or for example, sociology, you need something that actually talks about the way we interact. You can't just say, oh, well, certain people have XX, certain people have XY, therefore we can assume everything based off of that. You can't make any further predictions off of something when none of these things are necessary conditions to begin with.
So I just want to say a clever sleight of hand there, and this is what I was talking about, of people that try to redefine the term gender to meet self-identification, that it has to do with subversion of language, and you could interchange it as you see fit. Your criticism of me, please, let me finish.
We're trying to be more precise.
Your criticism of me using the term woman to mean the grammatical category of adult human female, right? Or gender is the grammatical category of the expression of sex. Your criticism specifically looking at the term man or woman is, but there are physical characteristics that you will not be able to have necessary conditions every time because there's abnormalities. But you agree that the term female should mean what we've accepted female to mean, and there are biological realities to it, despite the fact that it falls victim to the same criticism. So your real criticism of me using the word woman is that actually the word female is not always precise. You can't define exactly what a female is, but then you defeat your own argument by saying, but that's accurate. You can't define exactly what a word female means, but we accept it even though there are abnormalities.
Hey, Rob.
Therefore, like the idea that we have to reject the term woman for that is nonsensical. And when you say like,
you're not rejecting the word woman, Rob.
Real quick, when you say yes, but now you completely change, you're like, yes, but we need some sort of word to describe sort of how humans interact and their self-identity. Yes, we could have terms like that, but that is not historically what the term woman is meant. That's not the way we use it in any utility, and that's the is claim. Every study that we look that looks at pragmatic differences between men and women uses the term man and women to have an extension of biological reality. When we're talking about sort of the idea of using the word man, woman in a sentence to when it's the rubber meets the road, we're never talking about people's subjective definition of what they think man and woman means outside the scope of biological reality. The fact that someone could misidentify the biological reality is irrelevant to the greater scheme, that my definition is always going to have more utility than your definition, which is not only circular, which uses man in its definition of men, but it's, I'm almost finished, but is self-referential, and it could literally mean a different thing. Like, will you concede this? Every single person watching this chat right now could define the characteristics of men differently.
No.
That's not true. Explain how that's not the case.
So for one thing, there is some ubiquity to some of these categories to the point where most people you're going to meet are like that. Although if you want to see a good example of this difference between cultural norms, check out the Beverly Hillbillies. That show gives a great example of how those people just don't understand culture like we did. And so their gender norms were inherently different. What I'm trying to, just to keep you on track here, what I'm trying to get to is that since we can't make any inferences on what sex someone is from a singular variable, because none of these are necessary conditions, you also can't make higher order claims based on that variable as well. So just because someone is a human female doesn't necessarily tell us what they identify as, right? This comes down to accuracy and precision. We want language to be precise, which is part of why we change language over time as we learn more things about it, which is why we don't just always use things based on their historical context. But it's also about accuracy and making sure that if I say woman, I'm not excluding certain people who would otherwise qualify as women as far as our best definition can be. And instead it is actually accurate enough to include the people who would also be considered women. Now, if you're doing a study on medical science and physiology and stuff like that, then you probably care more about what their sexual reproductive functions are, what their chromosomes are like, what their hormones are like.
Why not say male, female instead of man, woman?
That is why in such medical literature, you do tend to see that distinction without as much. Well, you see medical literature that talks about healthcare differences for trans versus cisgender people.
Okay, but that's not like we're talking about outcome difference between likelihood to commit aggressive crimes. They use man, woman.
No, you see that too.
What's that?
You still see that too,
but most of those use the terms man, woman interchangeably with male, female.
But again, like that's not a criticism of the definition itself.
I want to call bullshit.
How the scientific,
if I may,
Rob,
real quick.
I need to get in here because you said something ridiculous.
You've been going a while, but so have I. It's fair.
How the scientific,
I feel like it's balanced.
I didn't even get to finish. How the scientific literature handles something is more of an argument that it should do better, which again, I've already posted a paper that talks about that. Not an argument that the word itself is useless.
Your paper just talks about the utility of having a term that has to do with self-identification. I will not.
But you said I haven't been arguing for utility. That's utility. I've been arguing for this whole time.
Please. Yes, no one denies that there is utility for terms of all sorts of things. The problem is using the term man, woman, or gender to change the meaning of what it's historically and colloquially meant. It has more damage than the utility of just creating a different word.
Now, I want to please
let me finish.
I don't know what you're talking talking about though, bro? I
I'm just
can't
not going
follow.
to answer you because
What
What
he's
did they
saying
specifically
is that
I'm not gonna answer
you're making the argument for utility, but you're not even utilizing it as the utility in which it should be meant, right? So if you change the utility constantly, then what's the point in that aspect?
You're
Or if
saying
you
there's
don't have a defined.
That's
You're
not
saying
true.
there
Go
that
ahead.
this study says there's utility in using the word man, woman to mean self-identification because it's important to have terms that don't erase people by not including how they identify as a self. I'm saying that your harm
That's
of needing a
accuracy?
term like that could be solved by creating a new term. But there are unique harms that come with subverting the language and changing the definition of man, woman to where it literally means nothing. Now, let me explain. I'm going to call bullshit on your claim. You're counterintuitive to say that each of us couldn't define man and woman in our own way because your definition of man or woman is the characteristics in which are usually exhibited by a man. You use the term schema. People
I think
who
I
have,
heard you. I think
please,
I heard you wrong there.
I'm
No,
going to
legit,
stop saying
I
please
think I
and say,
misheard that question.
okay, I'm going to stop saying please and say, is that better? Because please isn't
But
getting
don't
the
you
word
want?
across.
No, I'm
so,
trying. You're getting
I'll
me wrong
finish- I'll
here.
finish
Do you
my
want to be
point.
wrong about? Just real
Remember,
quick.
Sarah,
I think I
Well,
heard.
hold on, because you were agreeable, Furby, to being corrected. However, Rob did not state that or be agreeable to it. So he wants to finish what he wants to
Okay,
say.
if he wants to be wrong about what I said, then fine.
That
Okay.
and that's okay for you to come back and whatever the word is.
No, yeah, no, I'm dropping it. It's fine.
Okay. Like Sarah said at the beginning, when someone constantly is like, like it's difficult to keep a train of thought. So for the sake of having a good conversation, let me finish my point. So the point I'm going to make is when I said, could each of us define differently? You talked about the definition is people that have this schema of thinking different characteristics. And you said different people in different areas of the world could have different ideas of what those characteristics are. You yourself said that the characteristics that made you think that you're a woman, the schema, you said, oh, I didn't know you meant my schema. And then when I said, well, what is it that you think are the characteristics that make you identify as a woman? You said things like long hair, things like that. So I know someone who identifies as a woman who's fucking broad shoulders, butch. She has large gamete production. She has a vagina. She has short hair. She's got tattoos. She wears the clothes that we normally associate with men, flannel shirts and shit. Yet she identifies as a woman. Her schema is the exact opposite of what you say a woman's phenotypes would be. Is she wrong that she's a woman, or are you erasing her?
No, this all just proves my own point that I was making, that we actually can't use biological traits to determine gender identity and vice versa. And by the way, I didn't, when you first asked that question, I definitely misheard you. I thought you were asking more about like within the scientific community, like if we read like a scientific paper, can we read that paper with different definitions and would it still mean the same thing? Because that was what you were just talking about. No, but you can definitely meet people who feel like it's more masculine actually to be a good, be good with kids and be funny and actually have good emotional self-regulation rather than being like super angry or loud or whatever, versus other men who think that being loud and strong and super imposing on people and stuff like that, and not caring about kids so much as they care about work, and women can't be funny, so blah blah blah, like all these things these things vary a lot between people. So I definitely misheard you there.
Okay, so then in fairness, so you would acknowledge then, now that you're hearing me correctly, let's say that there's 500 people across different channels that are watching us right now. Each of us could come to vastly different conclusions on what the schema of what a woman is. We could all have 500 different unique proprietary definitions of that schema of what the characteristics that a woman exhibits are. I lost you there.
Mel, are you still with us?
Yeah, I think you muted, perhaps.
Yes, sorry. Yes,
No
I
problem.
did.
No problem. So there could be
and
500
yes,
different definitions of that, correct?
No, because not everyone's necessarily going to have the same one. Just some people will.
No, wait a minute. So if you're telling me right now that if I asked, let's lower the number. If I asked 10 different people, define to me the characteristics of what a woman is, that there's not going to be differences in each of those definitions?
Some differences, not total differences.
Okay, nonetheless, there would be differences. And when I asked you what your schema was, I'm telling you, and you could say I'm full of shit, but I guarantee you probably personally know people that this is true of. There are people that exhibit almost the exact opposite characteristics that you were saying the schema of women, such as being butch, having short hair, etc. That
Well,
still, please let me finish. That still
you're getting me wrong.
Please, that still identify as woman. So even if I ask, for example, a butch lesbian who's like ripped, facial piercings, exhibits like basically the characteristics that you would associate with a man, but she identifies as a woman. If I asked her, well, what are the characteristics that you think normally identifies a woman? It's entirely possible that she could say, oh, being petite, having long hair, wearing makeup, and yet still I call myself a woman. So why is, when she's admitting that the schema of what she says a woman is opposite of what she is, and yet she still calls herself a woman, why is she wrong?
Wait, no. First of all, can you provide me anyone who's like that?
Yes, there's plenty of lesbians that would say, I'm abnormal for what most women present as.
So in the butch lesbian context, these schemas, again, like I said, the butchness is a rejection of the norms, right?
Sure.
So someone aligns with that schema still, but they also reject them. So that person might also say, yeah, I'm a woman, but I don't do what other women do. But other women care about being pretty. They care about having nice long hair, or maybe even straightening or curling it. I don't give a shit about that, right? And so again, gender expression varies heavily between people, even if their genitals don't vary that much.
But that's going to be bad for your argument for two reasons. One, it proves that your definition isn't a necessary condition, to go back to that term.
I don't need a necessary condition.
Okay. It proves that it's not a necessary condition because your definition, correct me if I'm wrong, Liz, woman is someone who has like the schema or exhibits the characteristics of what they think a woman is. And so down you're saying, but it could also be the opposite of that a woman could be someone who intentionally subverts the expectation. So it could literally be the thing or the opposite of the thing.
So when you run into things like this, they're often social constructs. And the funny thing about social constructs is that they don't always exist within the plane of reality. Now, what happens is we start with like a term that we use more colloquially than accurately, like gender. And then we realize that like, oh, we're calling this group woman, but these other people who basically do the exact same schema as the woman around them with the intent to participate in it, and yet we exclude them. How does that make sense? And then a discussion evolved over time. You can say that's postmodern or cultural Marxism. Some of those people may have been, but not all of them were. Some of them were just very curious. How can we have this discrepancy without us actually either including them in, or like you said, coming up with the new term? The reason they didn't come up with the new term is what that paper talks about, the utility of it. It depends on what you're researching. If you're researching trans-specific healthcare, then of course you're going to want to ask people what they were assigned at birth, for example, or if they've transitioned or anything like that, because those details will matter greatly to the results. But if you're doing a sociological study on something that has nothing to do with gender and your only options are men or women, how do you know if a trans woman has selected man or woman? That's variability in your data. That's bad for research, especially in the soft sciences. So the best way to confine that is to remove that. In broader society, unless you want to be wrong, it's better to ask people, for example, what are your pronouns? And then they'll tell you, and then you can respect it, right? It's just the utility in society is a common courtesy thing. And the reason for this is because gender is not just a social construct, it's an internal identity, it's a behavior. It has nothing to do with biology. Biology happens at a much lower level in the neurobiology dogma, right? So you can have any set of biology and still give a certain set of behaviors. And likewise, you can have a specific biology and give a whole range of behaviors. Category A does not tell us about category B.
Okay, so that was a lot of words to say absolutely nothing. What your study is actually going to say, the way you described it, that from now on, I'm going to pause 10 seconds every time you interrupt.
Okay? Yeah,
so we'll see. We'll see how
open your rebuttal, buddy. If you're going to open your rebuttal with an
listen.
attack on my points, then you can sure as hell expect not to be in.
That's sort of what a debate is. It's an attack on each other's points. Correct?
Check this out. We've only got about it's right around 10 more minutes left. So if we could be respectful of each other's time. You guys have been fairly mild this evening, but still pretty interruptive to each other as well. So if we could just respect the last 10, and we'll get into the open panel, and then the cutthroatery can occur. Okay.
Rob, I will say I'm sorry for assuming you don't want to be wrong about the things, about the claims you made.
If you're going to attack my position in this debate, then I get to interrupt. Yes, that's a debate. We're attacking each other's So by definition, you say I get to interrupt you if you disagree with me. Good stuff. Anyways, I'll make
ahead,
the
Rob.
point. I'll take my 3 minutes that you just took there, if not longer, right? So this definition that you're talking about, or this study, what it's going to say is, well, it's important if you're discussing trans issues to talk about whether or not someone's trans. That's fine. You don't need to redefine the terms man or woman to be completely subjective, to be able to be particular and have that some sort of research. When you then say, when we take it to sort of the social sciences and we're trying to determine, it would be inaccurate if we didn't have these specific terms of how people self-identify, is wrong. We could see that the accuracy is something that's important, and the definition that you offer, the harms that you say that we need something that has to do with self-identification, would be met by just having other terms. We could ask someone, are you a man or a woman? And they could say man, and we could say, do you identify as having the characteristics of a man or a woman? And then they could answer that. That would be sufficient, if not creating two entirely new terms to solve the harms you're talking about. However, your solution creates a litany of other harms. For example, when we look at those sociological studies that have been done all through the past and are continuing to be done, and it says women make 79 cents to the dollar as man, they're clearly talking about the biological nature of male versus female. They did not take that study to ask people, well, how do you identify? Nor would there be utility in asking the question, how do you identify, and the study determining the difference between people that identify as men and identify as women. The utility would be in understanding the pragmatic differences between the biological sexes in outcomes that we have. No one gives a shit in how people identify and what the differences are and how they would identify. And again, when we get back to the utility, your term basically means nothing. You started off talking about schema. I started off my opening statement discussing that no matter what, that your definition will basically be, at the end of the day, you're a woman if you think you're a woman. You tried to make it complicated by saying, now actually what a woman is someone that exhibits the characteristics of what they think a woman is. Yet then when pressed, and I say, but what if someone exhibits the exact opposite characteristics of a woman, but still calls themselves a woman? You're like, well, that would be fair. They would be allowed to call themselves a woman because they're subverting the expectations of what a woman is. Therefore, in effect, the definition of woman, based on the fact that it could either be the thing you're saying, exhibiting the characteristics of woman, or be the opposite of that and exhibiting the characteristics of men, but that could still make you a woman, then the definition is quite simply, you're a woman if you say you're a woman. The problem with that is that means that the definition is entirely subjective, and no word that has a subjective meaning to each individual will have any utility whatsoever when it comes to a broader context, because the receiver of the message has no clue what you're talking about. Which is, again, why I get back to the point that if there are 500 of us listening right now, and you say there is a woman, we have 500 different examples of what we think that could mean. Some people might say, I think that woman means someone with long hair. Other people might say, no, I don't think that's sufficient. When I think of woman, I think of my mom, who had sort of a beehive haircut. So I don't think long hair comes with the definition of woman. And what we see is there's zero utility, because each individual now says there could literally be millions upon millions of definitions of what someone means when they describe someone as a woman. Language has to mean something through the receivers. There has to be sort of at least some sort of communal understanding of what that means. If the term is completely self-identifying, which you're conceding implicitly that it is, then the term loses all utility. All of the harms you're talking about erasing people and needing terms that mean self-identification are met by creating terms that have to do with self-identification. But separating gender, which has historical accuracy and is used in all pragmatic senses, including today, whether it be in studies, whether it be in someone discussing man or woman, there is always a connection to objective meaning and a rejection of woman. When I say woman, I literally just mean people that think that they're women. There is zero utility in that. So the way that things are is that gender is not different than sex. It's a grammatical category representing sex. And the way that they ought to be is to continue to be that way and to reject your ideology, because actually it makes the words completely meaningless, which rejects the accuracy and utility that you claim to be mentioning through this study.
All right.
Okay, this is going to be our final thoughts.
We'll move into that in about 5 minutes. So you're welcome to rebuttal and answer back to Rob. And you're welcome to take your time uninterrupted, thank you for being respectful.
Yeah. Language has to mean something, sure. It also can't miscommunicate things. And I think the biggest problem that we're facing today is that if you want to have a set of words that describe only normative people, then sure. but then you inherently have to make up new words for things. Now, the reason why we don't always do that is because there may already be words that exist that perfectly describe it fine, and not all contexts may even need this differentiation. And what you kind of realize when you think about the trans issue for a while, think about how much it actually matters when you meet someone on the streets, if they have a penis in their pants, when they're not telling you or not, it's minimal, right? Like we're talking like if you're planning on banging somebody, that's debatable. You can just, at the end of the day, you can always just walk out of the room. It's not like gonna kill you if they end up having a penis when you go to lay down with them. It's certainly not gay if you walk out of the room, so it's not questioning that. And when we talk about like what's the utility of not including trans people, unless like you really, really don't like trans people, or you really hate having to come up with some maybe more nuanced answers to things than we used to have, then there's every reason to include non-conforming people into a group that they otherwise seem very similar to. And otherwise, we normally don't need to make this distinction. If this were like let me tell you right now, if there was like a huge crime ring of trans people using their transness to scam people or something like that, I'd start to be like, okay, maybe we're giving this too much acceptance. But at the end of the day, like I'd start to maybe see the utility there. But at the end of the day, like they're distinctions without a difference until like we're talking about something like medical science, or this is like I'm talking to my actual psychologist about my gender history. So
sorry, I didn't.
So just to wrap it up, there's no reason, for example, not to use woman for a trans woman. And there's plenty of reasons to make that word inclusive for both groups in the majority of scenarios.
Should we have separate prisons for men and women?
Well, first of all, we have separate. We have segregated prisons.
I asked a simple
already.
question. Should we have separate prisons for men and women?
I'll say yes to segregation because separate.
So you would say that your answer is yes, we should have separate prisons for men and women.
Segregation, sure, yes.
Why do you keep saying segregation? I'm just asking quite simply because we might disagree.
Prisons exist where it's like the same building.
But I just mean when someone answers a question by throwing out another term and then saying yes, it implies that you're not just giving a simple yes/no answer. I'm just asking, would you say that the answer is quite simply yes, we should have separate prisons for men and women?
I think it's very clear that I'm saying yes either way, but I'm including segregated prisons just that way there's not any confusion.
Okay, so if you think we should have separate prisons for men and women, why would the reason be that you would think that?
Typically, there are differences in sexual abuse rates, sexual assault.
Really? Can you cite those studies?
You need a study to know that?
Yeah, I do.
That men are more likely to be the purveyors of more violent sexual assault, and women are more likely to be the recipients of more violent sexual assault.
Can you explain to me what makes people that identify as the characteristics the schema of men more likely to commit sexual abuse? Can you explain that to me? Why people that have a schema of men are more likely to commit sexual abuse?
This is something that the APA actually has a fascinating document about. It doesn't sound like it, but it's actually called something like recommendations for practices for boys and men, but they talk about something called gender role strain. And this has a lot to do with how we define masculinity in society. So if I say men are stoic, men are very straight, and men are super strong, right? We're going to keep it simple for now. And then someone feels emasculated in society, then they might resort to something like physical violence more likely than somebody who doesn't care if they feel emasculated like a woman. Now, going to the sex-related stuff, the interesting thing is that it seems like a certain part of the brain, especially in men, it has developed a certain way, so that way men are less likely to understand the difference between sexual behavior and aggression. Versus women tend to see a very clear line between these things. Again, not all men, not all women. And so again, it's more likely that men will act out sexual aggression than a woman.
So you even just there are conflating the term sex and gender. You're conflating the term men and women with male and female. Please. Come on. I'm trying my best.
You want to know why?
I'm trying my best to stay silent. And it's within 3 seconds every time of me talking, every single time you interject. It's just bad form. That's all I'm saying, right?
I will
So
be agreeable.
you're conflating the terms even there. Now the truth
It's
is
not a
that
conflation because I'm not talking about reproductive
Mel,
sex.
if you have to mute yourself to stop the interjections, please do so. Otherwise, Rob was kind. He gave you the floor, and I asked. We've got like 2 minutes left. Okay, and then we'll go into closing thoughts.
I will take those 2 minutes. So it is obvious that the reason that we would
You
have
get 1 minute for me to respond.
Mel.
No, if he takes 2 minutes and I need 2 minutes to respond.
We would have had 3 minutes had you not continued interjecting, and then you would have had a response.
This is just logistics at this point. I'm just trying to work that out so that way I actually have time to respond.
I wonder if men or women are more likely to interrupt. Interesting. Anyways,
men.
So you're a dude.
No, because a woman starts interrupting someone, it doesn't make them a man.
Okay. Now, nonetheless, getting back to the point, it's clear why you're conflating sex and talking about biological males more likely to be aggressive, et cetera, and you're using the term men and women when doing that. Because when I ask you specifically if we should have separate prisons for men and women, and you say yes, the clear understanding of why that is because the studies that you guffawed on, you're asking me for studies, you don't know that. Yes, those studies say that men are more likely to commit sexual violence than women, especially against women, and it has a lot to do with the biological reality because it's using the term men and women to be an identifier for biological sex. It's not saying, oh, studies that say that men commit 80% of sex crimes. Actually, those studies, what they did was interview every single person that commits those sex crimes that were a part of that study and said, how do you identify? Now, you then have this clever, again, sleight of hand where you're like, well, it's entirely possible because men, let's just say hypothetically that the definition of men are people that identify the characteristics that are masculine, such as of aggressiveness, et cetera, trying to then shoehorn the idea that a biological female that identifies as a man would have similar sexual aggressive characteristics, sexual assault characteristics as a biological male. That's not true. No study's going to say that, but that's not going to help you anyways because we've already gone through why your definition of man would be someone that exhibits the characteristics we think of men or someone who intentionally subverts and has the opposite characteristics. So therefore, if we took to the logical extension of what you're saying, having one prison for men and one for women would literally just mean we would have to ask every single person, are you a man or are you a woman? And if the person said, I'm a woman, even though they had all the characteristics of a biological male, we would say, fine, then you go over there into your women's prison. Now, what likely would happen in that scenario is women would be scared shitless because now biological men are being put in their spaces. So they would say, well, shit, I'll pretend to identify as a man. Then all of a sudden the categorization would mean nothing. And prisons would literally just be made up of biological males and biological females interspersed amongst each other because instead of assuming that man is, and we should segregate based on man and women, which has connection to sex, we're just saying it's all self-referential, which means the physical harms. Last point, which means that the actual real world implication is more biological females, or what I would call women, are going to be sexually assaulted. There is real world danger. And the fact that you interchange, even as your answer, as someone who claims to have a better understanding of what the term gender should be, and you yourself make the mistake of conflating man and woman, meaning male and female, proves that I win the prompt once more, that gender is not different from sex because you can't even help yourself in interchanging those words.
You got 30 seconds, Mel, and then we'll move into closing statements.
Hell no, I don't.
Yes, Mel, listen.
This is why I interrupted him to point out that taking 2 minutes is a filibuster against me. So are you filibustering me too, Sarah?
No, Mel, listen to me. What I'm saying is that he was trying to get his thoughts out and you continued to interrupt him. Then we went into the semantics or meta of talking about the talk. Okay. I'm giving you 30 seconds so you can still hold your thoughts for closing statements, which you can go on all night long practically. So 30 seconds for a quick response, and then we'll go into closing statements, please. Thank you.
So you just must like being wrong about my points because that wasn't a conflation. I started talking about gender roles strain, and then I explained how there are differences between groups. The simple answer for why that would still prove my point, by the way, is because we actually still need to examine trans people and what their rates of abuse at the hands of cisgender men are. And guess what? It's actually higher than it is with women. So definitely don't want to put them in a men's prison.
All right. Rob, if you'd like to begin with your closing
Do we have a
statements.
time frame we're looking at? I'll keep it whenever you say. It could be 1 minute.
I mean,
2 minutes.
I'd say like
How
4
about he
minutes?
gets 30 seconds and I get 2 minutes?
I'd say we can go into 4 minutes apiece. We'll kind of, I'm
Sounds
not
good.
going to like hard line
Sure.
it, but be, mindful.
Okay, so to the prompt, is gender different than sex? I argue in two ways. That one, the way it has always been and is before there was a radical change by people with political and cultural axe to grind, was that we actually use the word as a grammatical category that is an expression of biological sex. Of course, there could be extremes where things get lost in the shuffle. People can misapply it. But in general, that's what we're talking about. We're comparing that to gender and the idea of it being self-referential, where a man is anyone who thinks they're a man, a woman is anyone that thinks they're a woman. We saw that there was a clever rhetorical trick that was employed that said that it was something more than that it had to do with schema. But then he admits, or they admit right through the gate, that actually, when you start to investigate that schema doesn't really matter, because you could have a schema of what women are and then actually be the opposite of that, and still, because you call yourself a woman, be a woman. So therefore, as I predicted, any definition that you hear people that conflate gender in the way that he is always going to be something that is self-referential. And you could see the real world implications of how that's bad. All the studies that talk about the difference of men and women are implying a biological reality to it. When we talk about the necessity for having women's spaces and men's spaces, you could see, as it's admitted, that we should have segregated prisons for men and women. You could see the conflation even there. They sort of backtrack on it because there's no possible answer to that conflation. When he said, yes, men commit more crime, blah, 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 more sexual abuse. Again, that's not him discussing people that identify as men. That's talking about people that there is a connection to biological reality. Mel understands that actually, because of the reality of men committing aggression more against women, that we should segregate them. The fact that there is a population that chooses to present differently, and perhaps they should have their own segregated space, is fine. But it doesn't change the fundamental question of whether or not we should have a segregated space for men, i.e. adult males, and women, i.e. adult females. Because if we didn't, there would be real world harm of women being abused in these prisons all the time. Because there's an abnormality that would lead to people being attacked. It would be the same with people that aren't transgender but are dragged and exhibit that in prison. The assaults that they would receive would probably be very similar to trans people. They could be self-segregated, that's fine. However, we could still see the need for this segregation. So there is the way that things are, and there is the ought of how they should be. I think that it's clear that the definitions that's being offered by Mel are self-referential. They're circular. That there's a mistake that Mel makes constantly with conflating these issues, and that the only downside of my issue, or my definition, where it's saying that it's adult human female, adult human male, and that it's a categorization, gender is just a grammatical category of the extension of biological reality. There's really no harms except, but you're erasing people that identify in a certain way. You can see when we get to specific terms, for example, when I'm talking about, well, I identify as a way as tall, Mel again makes a mistake of saying, well, you can't do that because there's an objective measurable reality. Same would be true with the idea of man-woman. We could objectively measure whether or not you're a male or female, an adult human female or adult human male. It's just subversion for the sake of subversion. We didn't get into the history of John Money and all the stuff he did. We didn't get into the actual harms and how the people that use this are being subversive to sort of increase degeneracy, increase indoctrination to children, and how it's being used to set up this categorization of oppressed versus oppressors. It is clear for the sake of utility that all terms need to have some sort of meaning that's outside the scope of each individual's subjective meaning. The term that Mel gives for what a man and a woman would be would literally mean that anytime you hear the term men, you're going to think something that's completely different than the person next to you, and the person next to them, and the person next to them. So what is the meaning of that word? If tall means anyone higher than 6 inches, then that means that everyone's tall, and therefore the definition loses meaning. An even easier point to understand is if to be tall just means anyone who considers themselves tall, then the meaning of using the word tall ceases to lose its descriptive functions. And the idea of saying, but that's measurable, isn't going to help because your biological sex also is measurable. So for those reasons, I think it's easy to see that there's all sorts of insanity that's going on here in circular logic. We actually do exist in a society in all utility, and the way people colloquially use the term, that gender is basically the same as sex. It's a categorization of it. People are increasingly rejecting Mel's worldview, and I'm happy to say it. That's why it's more than an 80-20 issue, all of this crazy batshit lunatic trans stuff. And we're seeing that when it comes to utility, that every time in the instance of like the police officer scenario, you yell, it's a woman. The reason you yell that, it's not that you can't be inaccurate in identifying it. And when you're saying woman, it's because you think they look like a woman. It's that we clearly understand that the definition can't be subjective. You would not in that moment say, I don't know if it's a woman. I didn't ask them what they identified as. And my definition of woman is merely if they say they're a woman, they're a woman. Mel's going to, in the closing statement, say, no, that's not what I said. Throw terms around like schema. But I want you to remember, as Mel rejects this, that's what happened. Ask yourself this. But wait a minute, Mel. If someone says the schema, i.e. the characterizations of what they individually think a woman is one thing, but chooses to call themselves a woman and exhibits the exact opposite characteristics of what they themselves say a woman is, are they still a woman? Mel has to bite the bullet and say yes, else she's erasing people. And so therefore the definition is quite simply, despite all of the add-ons, if you identify as a woman, you're a woman. If you identify as a man, you're a man. So any claims of needing the utility for terms that reference self-identity is outweighed by the fact that you have taken these terms that historically have meant one thing and have utility and made them completely meaningless because they literally just mean if you identify it as it, you are that. I think it's an easy win.
Thank you, Rob. Mel, the floor is yours.
Worth noting that peacocking, which according to Urban Dictionary is the act of pretending like you won and puffing out your chest when you didn't, is something I've noticed men mostly do. We started this with me saying gender is something very not circular, by the way. I purposely didn't use woman in it. And then I gave an example within that definition that did, just so that way people who might have gotten lost can maybe get brought back on track. And Rob decided to fixate on that. And I think that there's a theme going on here of actually very stylistic rhetoric from Rob that doesn't really rebut most of my points. In fact, I don't feel like I've had any of my points truly challenged tonight. For example, my point about gender schemas, my point about other things. Whenever I brought something up, what I got in return was, you don't have a study on this, or you don't actually have a response, or you're just conflating things, not realizing that Rob's actually kind of proving for me that he doesn't understand the difference between conflating things in something that's interconnected with something else. Because as I stated at the beginning, just because the way we score things on two different sports are interconnected does not make those sports the same thing. So maybe, Rob, try again when you actually know what a conflation is. And even better yet, when you can remember what my arguments actually were, especially since I made both circular and non-circular definitions of gender for you, since you seem to want those circular ones. You should also stop saying that, I don't have studies for things. You didn't really ask for studies, nor did we actually unpack any of these things. Granted, when I went to go read a passage, I lost it trying to make sure I got the name right, which is a huge fail on my part. So I will give you that. There is no biological reality, quote unquote, that's your words, that you can point to that actually tells us what a man or a woman is or isn't. Because as I've proven tonight, there is no necessary condition that you can identify that without it either is or isn't a woman. Therefore, there is nothing that is in the definition of woman that can be dependent on that thing. And I can agree there's a bimodal, again, interconnectivity that we associate to these things based on tradition, but just because something's traditional doesn't make it right. And the utility here is to be accurate about it. When we say woman, sometimes we want to say trans woman or cisgendered woman to be more specific. Sometimes we're just talking about all women regardless if they're trans or not, because sometimes we're saying statements that don't rely on being trans. Going back to the prison thing, this is where your example about segregation falls apart completely. I 100% agree. We need to examine these issues closely. We need to talk about the differences for cisgendered and transgendered inmates and look at all possible avenues of solutions as a thing, because I'm actually interested in the best outcomes for people. And that kind of goes back to what you're saying about if I had a schizophrenic person who thought they were I forget what you actually said. I think you made it personal. I don't want to attack that because that was actually very nice of you to say. But the reality of it is, if we don't affirm schizophrenic people's delusions, because that will lead to worse outcomes. But if we don't affirm the gender identity of a trans person, guess what that does? that leads to worse outcome. So if you're a clinician and you're actually trying to improve the outcomes of your patient, what you want to know is, how can I help treat them properly? Not how do I enforce my dogmatic worldview onto them? How do I actually treat them and help alleviate their pain, which is why we treat gender dysphoria the way we do. It has nothing to do with cultural Marxism, it has nothing to do with feminism. We came up with these new words as a slow discussion in the literature about how the old way of using it is not precise enough to actually give us the resolution we need in statistics. And then it became eventually like, oh, maybe we've just been kind of lazy with how we've been using this word the whole time. When I say that these things are not the same, it's a very, very visible thing. People act out gender. You cannot be a gender. You cannot be born of it. You can act out of it. You can be a part of that group, or you can be seen as not a part of that group, or you cannot do the actions. But at the end of the day, someone will look at your presentation when telling the cop, that's who mugged me. They're not going to, you're right. I'm not going to ask that person who just mugged me, by the way, what are your pronouns? I need to tell the cop that. That would actually be pretty comical. Maybe even, ask them like their social security number and stuff like that too, just for extra clarity. But I will tell the cop the features that I think identify them the best. And so again, going back to, unless it matters, trans women are just as much women as cis women, because the notion of gender can happen independently of biological sex, and that's why you don't see necessary conditions. I did actually enjoy this debate. Rob, I do think you can do better. I don't think you.
Oh, I thought I
don't think you made very salient points.
You accused me of peacocking, but isn't this a form of that? I think that you absolutely got crushed, which is ironic, seeing as how this is probably the topic you talk about the most.
I mean, that's your opinion, and I certainly can't tell you that what's in your own head is wrong, but I can tell you that from an exterior perspective, there's a lot of things that don't.
You want to take a poll?
Someone who's winning here, like telling me I don't have studies when I clearly do.
You didn't have it. Name the study you cited.
Here, we'll do this. Nobody ever wins the debates. The chat always wins the debates.
Actually, that's what I was going to finish on, my point, by the way, before I was rudely interrupted. I will say this, I don't always agree with your chat, Sarah, but your chat is always going. We've had over 1,000 comments since this debate started, and that blows my mind. Like, that's not even my record, and I feel like accomplished for helping you hit that, Sarah. So your chat really is great. It's always a blast to be in there. And Sarah, I always really do appreciate you hosting these debates, because Lord knows I'm a difficult person to put up with. That face, yeah. No, that's 100% facts right there, was that face.
Mel, you always like to push my limits you're lucky I have children, because it makes this significantly easier, because they like to push my limits on a daily basis, and you always take it one step further. In any event, I'm very thankful. Mel, I would actually go as far as saying this is the best performance from you that I've seen yet. Still mildly into the interruptions, but you're doing significantly better, and you were very focused with your arguments, and I thought that was a very significant piece. So I want to commend you for that. You're
Rob,
doing much better.
Rob, despite what I said, and I'm going to reverse my own peacocking here, because I slightly agree with you on that point. You are a difficult person to debate, even if I thought you could have done better on certain things. That's just my own opinion, and you can take that as being trash if you want. That's why feel free to give it.
Listen, most people think that they won the debate. I think, or when they debate, they think they won because they prefer the type of arguments that they themselves are making. Obviously, I take no offense whatsoever to anything you say. I enjoyed myself thoroughly. The interruption thing got a little aggravating by the end of it, but that's no big deal. It's not like we were physically assaulting either, calling for violence or some shit. It could get way worse, so
this was pretty mild. I mean, Jim Bob's been here, and that's probably one of my toughest. Well, I call him my bulldog here, because he's just one of the toughest ones to rein in with the interruptions. But let's go ahead to the chat. I have dropped the open panel dumpster fire link if anybody's watching on Rob's end. I know, Mel, you're not dual streaming, but if anybody's watching on Rob's end, or Rob, if you want to pin that same StreamYard link to yours, that's fine as well. I know people are already backing up into the the backstage. So we're going to run through these super chats. Some really interesting ones came in, and we'll get through those, and then we'll go ahead and go into open panel dumpster fire. All right. Jess Gerald is whoring around from the Crucible again, and he's running over on Rob's side too. Nobody tell Andrew. There's a distinct lack of super chats. Sarah's going to need to grift harder. And thank you for the kind reminder to everyone, Jess. I appreciate you.
Jess is always on point with his super chats.
He is. He's pretty good. And for the record, you guys are welcome to respond to the super chats. If you have nothing, no worries. Otherwise, we'll just keep moving on. Rude Mudcrab in with the big 10. Sex is objective, whilst gender is subjective observation that differs through history and culture. Men once wore dresses, high heels, and makeup. Debate over. Have a nice day. I think that one's to you, Rob, if you want to respond.
Sure. If you say, by default, I say my definition of gender is correct, therefore it's correct. Right. I'm disagreeing with you that that's what gender is. If you look, like you say, throughout history and culture, when people said men, they might say it's men traditionally wear this clothes. But when they were saying men, they meant adult biological males. And so it's just because you have decided to accept the change in definition, probably for bias reason, doesn't mean that that's the way things have historically been, nor does it mean it's the way things are today. People are rejecting that, and nor does it mean that it is the way things ought to be. The definitions that you would embrace, that every single person I've ever debated or saw debate on this, is the definition of woman is anyone who thinks they're a woman. The definition of man is anyone that thinks they're a man. That has more harms than any slight flaws you could see with saying that gender is just the grammatical category of sex, and that a man has a biological component to it and a woman has a biological component. So I massively disagree with your conclusion.
By the way, I remember something I forgot from my conclusion. Like when you say it's a grammatical definition, I partially agree with you, actually. Like we need it to explain to us why we use pronouns the way we do. But again, we need to use it to describe it accurately. And one of the things that aren't involved with discerning pronouns, aside from their tangential relation to secondary sex characteristics, are hormone levels, your gametes, and chromosomes.
I don't understand what the point you're making is.
It would just suck as a grammatical definition if we tried to include biological factors in there.
No, that's not true. It is biological factors, and it's the things that we as we observe it, we understand what men traditionally look like and women traditionally look like. But the term itself, so you could misapply it. I could say that someone's a man, and it turns out that they're not, that they're just presenting as a man. That still doesn't change the fact as whether or not they're a man or not.
So why do we need it to be a grammatical definition?
Because you have to use identifier words like he, she. Like for grammar and the way that syntax works for our language, we need terms that mean that, right? And you wouldn't say that she is male, right? Right, that's not a term, or you wouldn't say she is sex, right? You need a specific term that is the grammatical expression of sex, and we called that term gender. That's what things like pronouns are.
Well, actually, you could say she is biologically male, because as I'll point out, the second half of the definition you gave for gender is all we really need to figure out, for example, how to use pronouns, which was a part of the example you gave. We actually don't need, again, to know someone's biology to know through gender presentation whether or not someone might expect he or she pronouns on average.
But again, you constantly, including rude, I'm not going to say that middle word, crab.
He goes by mud crab too, by the way.
Okay. You beg the question. You say, well, my definition's correct, so therefore it's correct. No, what I'm saying is I'm saying that the word means something completely different than what you're suggesting. It has nothing to do with self-identification. And if we're evaluating whose idea we should prefer, and we've both conceded that things like utility and accuracy are important, I think that it is inevitable that the side that says the word literally means what each individual says that it means is always going to be worse for utility and accuracy than me saying at least there's some sort of stable quantification that people understand to expect what it means. Like, you can't get away from it as much as you're continually self-contradictory when you're like, you understand saying like, well, it has to have utility. And so when we say man, what we really mean is someone that presents as a man. And then it's almost under your breath you have to say, or someone that doesn't present as a man. Then what good is the term?
It's not internally contradictory. In fact, a lot of definitions are internally of gender or that conflate sex are the ones that are internally contradictory.
Give me a term
Sorry,
that's descriptive
gender,
that can mean itself or
gender
the opposite of itself.
Rob, actually, no, I forgot. It is internally contradictory, but only because, again, it's man-made and it's not reliant on any actual true factors in reality, other than the fact that we can observe that people express their gender. They don't just say like, they aren't just thinking like I have a penis all the time, so therefore I do this. They're acting out a sense of identity. That identity defines who they are. And so they develop over time a certain set of behaviors. Now, when we're coming back to accuracy and communication, the point of pronouns isn't to tell me what genitals someone has. The point of pronouns is to help me figure out if I'm talking about one group or another. Groups are and genders are almost like synonymous.
No, they're not. Right? No one, when they say men, it's no one that's referring to men says people that exhibit the characteristics of men or people that don't exhibit the characteristics of men. Can you give me, you say that, well, yes, it could be internally contradictory because it's a social construct. Can you name me one term in any language that's not a social construct?
Final thought, Mel, and then we're moving on.
Yeah, anything that observes through objective reality, like tree.
No, that's not true. Tree is a social construct. We created a word that is a symbol of sounds that means the term tree. That is a social, all language is a social construct by definition. That doesn't mean that we should have utility of having internally contradicted definitions for terms.
Okay. The sarcastic saint comes in with a big 5. If Logan paints his fingernails, puts makeup on his face, lipstick on the lips, and waxes his legs, then what should he identify as? Man, woman, or creep? And I believe there was a little chat war going on in there for that minute. A thumping Weevil with the big 2. Why argue with a man about this?
I guess that's for me? Or no, it could go both ways considering your chat.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it really could. The chat's always like back and forth on left and right. Gesturald with the big 2. Woman, an adult human that was born with a clam. Why do people keep trying to complicate something so basic? Why do we need they, them, turtle, self? What is the utility beyond trying to make oneself believe they're special? And I will add to that, I think that is because we would normally, if a dude tried to dress up in a dress, for instance, and go to the grocery store and pretend to be womanly, we would just call that a weird dude, right? Before all of this other stuff came out, like even if he tried to present or so on and so forth, or said, "Yeah, my name's Claudia" or some shit like that, like we would just say it's a fucking weird dude. So I am kind of questioning that whole. I'm agreeable to the concept of they're special, right? Everybody wants to be special, so then we can just change up definitions to make us special.
By the way, putting yourself into a category that gets bullied and faces more violence is a weird way to feel special, but okay. The utility is, again, like we're getting smarter with these things, and now we realize that that when we say like that's basic, right? It's almost too basic to actually also describe sex, because, for example, someone else might say chromosomes, and that person who's born with a clam could be a 46XY with androgen insensitivity syndrome.
It is about feeling special. The idea that there aren't privileges that come with that are nonsensical. We have a society where many cultural institutions have embraced victimhood as the top sort of currency that you can have. So I personally known at least several people in communities I in that were far left, particularly the collegiate debate, that were white males, and therefore they were at the bottom of the social justice stack, and they inserted themselves straight to the top of that community by saying, I'm trans, now I'm a woman. Now they have the highest victimhood of anyone. And so the idea of inserting yourself, again, you could do this literally with any category, right? The idea of, well, we have to include people that think they are this, even if it's just because they self-identify, regardless of what the objective reality is. And that is what your definition is, because you could be the schema that is what people think women are, or the opposite of that. So it's just self-referential. Then I could say that every single study that we do on any term, such as firefighters are more likely to have long-lasting marriages than others, I could say, but that erases people that technically aren't firefighters but identify as it. Why have you erased them? You can see the absurdity of this, how we just make language then completely self-referential, and it's impossible to have any utility with the terms because we can't have any descriptors that have objective meaning between people. That doesn't mean that each term that we have doesn't have fringe sort of escape of what we mean. When I say chair, you might think of something slightly different than chair. But if chair could mean shoe or cat or horse or the opposite of chair, something that you could only stand on and not sit on, then the term chair no longer means anything. Same would be true with the terms man or woman.
So going back to the first thing you said, because that was a lot, needing protection is not a form of privilege. Immunity from the thing that you would need protection from is the privilege, right? So systemic violence, needing protection from that does not create privilege. In fact, it means that you're inherently outed by that protection. You're often a minority group, by the way, so it's not very easy to have privilege as a minority group. But most importantly, the having to fight for that protection is usually not a privilege. Privileges are defaults.
You have a categorization error where every category that we could see, whether it be, you could break people into infinite categories. What is your sex? What is your gender, if you want to use a different term? What is your height? What is your religion? What is your ethnicity? And we could say, the conflation is people say, well, one of that group has privilege and the other doesn't. That's not true. For example, I am white. I have privilege as a white person. It is also detrimental to me to be white in certain circumstances. So even if you could say overarchingly trans people are more likely to be victims of violence, et cetera, there's not a direct line that it is because they have self-identified as trans. For example, the type of person that has a mental illness that makes them think that they're trans might be one reason, but it still doesn't mean, even if we concede that there
Can we
wouldn't
do
be—
one point at a time for
Yes,
super
I'll
chats?
finish. It still wouldn't mean that there aren't certain privileges that are provided to you, even if there are certain detriments, because every category has detriments and privileges.
So, if you want to categorize things properly, you certainly don't want to be so reductive that you miss things, and thus you're wondering why do all my studies have weird results? My categories are inherently better than yours, especially because my categories aren't the sort of things that only an ignoramus could love, right? Like, I actually look at these things with nuance.
Let me ask you this. Would that by definition mean that we should always prefer broader definitions for every term because it would be more inclusive?
No, this is less broad than just simply conflating sex and gender.
That's not true at all. In fact, you're saying by just conflating sex and gender, it, quote, erases people. And so therefore we need to broaden it to make sure that there aren't people that feel left out.
That's inclusivity, not broadness.
Okay, so then we should have more inclusivity. So any term, if we could have a more inclusive definition of it, we would always prefer the more inclusive?
When it's more accurate, yeah.
What would define accurate?
Define the thing that actually describing the thing that is the purpose that we're trying.
But you're saying we should have this gender mean this because it's more inclusive, therefore it's more accurate because it's more inclusive.
Yeah, in this case, it is more accurate when it's more inclusive.
But why is it more accurate? Just because
I've already pointed out when you do these things, then you do like a survey and you don't include those categories, then you get a bunch of noise in your data where people choose what they think is the right choice and they don't actually know, and therefore and you start getting results that you don't understand. When you actually have something that, okay, well, we're asking all women, but wait, cis women and trans women exist. Now that we know this, we're not just going to forget that and pretend that they're all cisgendered. We're going to actually ask them the difference because the difference matters here.
But you defeat your own argument again, because then the status quo before we changed the definition of gender would have erased all confusion. We all understood what we meant by the term man and woman. The confusion that would be brought in is because people like you decided we're going to change the definition. When I ask you why,
I don't think you understand semantics though, Rob.
Let me finish.
No. Like you've been cutting me off.
Hold on, Mel, because you're gonna have the last thought on this. You're gonna have the last thought on this, and we're moving on.
When I ask you why would we do this, you're like, well, because it's more accurate. I say, what makes it more accurate? You say it's more inclusive. Therefore, we would reason that any definition of any term that, quote, was more inclusive, i.e. included more people, should be preferred. And by definition, we would say because it's more inclusive, it's more accurate. So therefore, I decide to define the term firefighter as any red-blooded American. There, it includes more people. Therefore, it's more accurate. It's more inclusive. So firefighter means any American.
So no, you cannot create logical inconsistencies with your claims, and this is what we're actually not doing, is creating a logical inconsistency. To put it just like that, that was such a bullshit salad. It's really, really simple. It's so simple, right? The term dog, right? We don't every time we say dog, we don't always specify a breed, but if we're talking about breeds of dog, then we probably will, right? Do you understand how language works now?
Yes, I understand how language works. That has nothing to do with that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. You're saying that the definition. Listen, wait. Again, you're saying that the definition.
I'm going to throw something in here. You cannot exclude yourself from a certain thing and then ask the people around you to then include you with these new conditional concepts.
That's not what happened. So that's completely irrelevant.
Sounds like it's a form of excluding. You're excluding yourself from, let's say,
has nothing to do with what I said, Sarah.
Woman.
Sarah, my point is very simple.
I'm making a point.
How language works is that when we categorize
you are
things,
excluding yourself from a certain definition and then asking everyone to mold the definition
has
around
nothing
you
to do with what I said, because nobody's excluded themselves.
To re-include yourself back in. That makes no
totally
sense.
Irrelevant.
I agree with the special concept.
Totally irrelevant to how language works. Jeff. So here's how language works. By the way, when you are speaking colloquially about something, when you're speaking about a broad group, you use the term that refers to the broadest category. When you're talking in specifics, then you talk in specifics. One of the things that we have started doing less and less in this modern, much more brave and much smarter era is not making false assumptions, so that way we can avoid category errors. It's that simple.
So I'll finish with this, right? He said, when you could see the absurdity of this, because when I say, well, then I want a broader definition of the word firefighter, and it'll mean something like everyone that lives in this country. And they're like, Mel's like, well, you can't have it be an internal contradiction. But there's no reason given why that's an internal contradiction. It's just I've changed the definition.
No, I said it can be an internal contradiction. I said the logic can't defeat
Why do you do this?
itself.
It's so damn frustrating. Repeatedly, I sit here quietly and let you ramble on and on and on. And then I start talking and you interject repeatedly.
I literally just got interrupted by the host, dude. Like, come on.
Then talk to the host, not me.
Special.
I'm going to finish my point.
Stop victimizing yourself.
So I'm going to finish my victimizing myself. Please.
Finish your thought, Rob. Mel, if you need to mute yourself, you can scream behind the mic with yourself muted, and that might help.
So literally, the internal contradiction, there's no reason given that this is an internal contradiction. It meets the criteria of being the broadest definition possible, which would be a good thing. And even if we say, but wait a minute, what does that really have to do with firefighter? The same would be true of the concept of gender, of how we understood it, that it had to do with sort of the expression grammatically of sex, of male and female. What does self-identification have anything to do with that? But because Mel prefers that and says because it's preferred, because it's more inclusive and broader, we should accept it. The idea of, but it can't be an internal contradiction. I can't make it more simple than this. Your definition literally is an internal contradiction, because man means someone who presents what we think a man does, and someone who presents.
Definition, buddy.
Please,
he's not letting his plane. He's just doing one fucking straw person after another.
Okay, please shut up. I take back my compliment I gave to you. You have now referred back to old traditions and habits of interrupting everybody. Please stop.
Because he's just going to use this.
Mel, it's his opinion.
Do you know what is a filibuster, Sarah?
Mel,
what is a filibuster?
Now you're arguing me. This is how people lose access to my panels, by being completely disrespectful little shits. Please stop. Let him finish his thought. Mel, it doesn't matter. It's the fucking super chat.
When you give the definition, it'll be what he's doing.
It is the super chat read off.
So he should land his plane at some point, right? Okay. Then he should probably land his plane at some point.
Mel,
yes or no?
I'm going to give you an opportunity to stop before I have to do things that I don't want to do, meaning use the mute button or put you backstage so that he can finish his thought. He has been respectful. Please give it back.
If you're going to say it's a super chat time, then you also got to make sure he lands his plane.
All right, I can just take my ball, I can go home, and we can end all this, Mel, and I cannot platform you anymore, and you can go find another panel. Which
can we just make sure he lands his plane
in
some reasonable point?
Would you like?
I would like him to land his plane within a
I would
reasonable amount
like
of
you
time.
to choose. Would you
I
like
would
to
like him
shut
to
your
land
mouth,
his
or would you
plane
like
within
to
a
go find
reasonable amount
another
of time.
panel to hang out on?
I would like him to stop being an NPC with
Mel,
no end,
you
with
are
no
being
limit.
emotional, and this is becoming a bothersome to the show and moving forward. There are a bunch of people waiting backstage to get on. I cannot move on if we don't finish our fucking thoughts. Now shut your mouth or turn the mute button on so you can talk out loud all
I'm
you
not
want
stopping you from muting
without Mel. You know, I have a transparency rule in which I try not to mute people. I'm trying to be respectful and give you the opportunity to do the shit for yourself.
me. It's disrespectful to let him filibuster.
Be a fucking grown up and shut your mouth. Thank you. Rob, if you'd like to finish your thought, please, and then we will move on to the next super chat.
No
Thank you.
problem. So the definition given, even though terms like schema were used, was man is a person that presents the characteristics that they think of men. And also those.
All right. I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to do it for you. Thank you.
So he said those that present the characteristics of what they think men are. And also it could be those that intentionally do the opposite of presenting those characteristics, thereby exhibiting that his own definition is a contradiction, which he said we cannot accept.
Okay. Is that the end?
Yeah. It would have been much quicker. And to the point of filibustering, Mel, we've both been talking at great length. The difference is I don't accuse you of filibustering and interrupt, and that's what you do to me.
All right. So let's move into the next one. And
I'm sorry, I'd like a response, please.
No, we're moving on. I said
So
we're
if I can
moving
trigger
on.
you with one
Okay.
word, you're just a snowflake.
Mel, you're not triggering anyone. What you are doing is
literally did wrong,
disrupting
and he
the
acted
movement.
like, "Oh my
Okay,
God,
I'm going to do this again. You're disrupting the movement of a show. It is a show for a fucking reason. There are people waiting backstage. We have a rule. We try to move through super chats as quickly as possible so that we can get them up. You are now disrupting the order, and that pisses me off, and it's very obnoxious, and I have no reason to platform you anymore going forward. So consider this your last panel, Furby, just out of disrespect. All right, we're going to try this again. All right. And if we could get to one response per person at this point, I don't care if there's a rebuttal. I don't care if there's a refute. We want to get through this so that we can move the fuck on. Thumping Weevil in with the big five. I can say for my son that has abnormal chromosomes that he has never confused his gender. It's all delusional if you want to add extra genders. Mel, do you have a thought?
Yes. So
go ahead.
Sex presentation is the overlapping function between gender and sex. Modesty, aka immodesty, behavioral cues, and secondary sex characteristics contribute to norms, aka differences in sex that a society has. When someone wants to be seen in a certain way, they either fulfill those roles, which we consider gender conforming, or they do not, which we consider gender conforming. So here are some arguments for distinction. There's a biological basis for sex, and that does not have anything to do with gender. Chromosomes like XX and XY may exist, but they can also exist in a bimodal distribution that isn't always aligned to a binary understanding. Therefore, at the very least, gender itself can also not be binary if it has anything to do with sex. Hormonal differences can also happen, which also means that we cannot use someone's hormonal status of having lots of testosterone or estrogen alone to infer behavioral outcomes. And the same can be true for anatomical variations. So the easy way of putting this, right, folks, is that there's a lot more overlap than there is difference between these groups. Gender is socially constructed. We are socialized to act a certain way based on what the people around us think our gender is. And then when your internal gender dysphoria, when that's so wrong that you can feel that you can't possibly live up to those expectations, what do? We say, wow, you must be transgender. It's not that hard to consider that you could be across mentally from your biological designation. And you know what? I was going to filibuster, but I think I've made my point.
Rob, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I'll just say real quick on this, but even that statement at the end is proven untrue by the own argumentation, because you could literally think that the expectations of what a man and woman is are completely opposite of what you're presenting and still call yourself a man or woman. And so therefore the term is completely self-referential. And even if we accept that there's any sorts of utility in having these terms mean something about self-identity, which I don't accept, their terms, the way that they are issued, are always going to be be worse because it literally just means whatever you think that it means. It could mean the opposite of what you think a woman is presenting as means you're a woman, or it could mean exactly what presenting as a woman is means you're a woman. So even if we accept that there are problems with the status quo definition, which I don't think there are, the definition that's being offered by Mel and other people that seem to conflate gender with identity is always going to be infinitely worse because it means nothing.
Okay. And then John Mosman with the big 5 says, Mel, you are conflating the conditions for biological sex for female versus being a woman. Mel, do you want to respond to that since it's directed at
thanks.
you? Okay. Thumping Weevil says with a big 10, tell me the difference between a man and a woman's pelvic, because that's where a baby will be pushed through. A man's pelvic can't change like a woman's unless gender is only sexuality to you. Mel, do you have a thought?
Nope.
Rob, do you have a thought?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Trib says it's not hard. Man/woman does not equal male/female. Applying it in real life would have Blair White as a woman and Buck Angel as a man because gender. Use your eyes.
That's not true. Like, for example, if we take that to its logical extrapolation, if I wear football gear everywhere, if I was on here with shoulder pads and, the whole gear and looked like a Pittsburgh Steeler, would I be a football player? I say I am a football player, even if I've never played. And you'd say, use your eyes. Clearly, you're a football player. So therefore, football player means anyone who says they're a football player. No, instead, what would happen would be I was wearing the costume of a football player, but I'm not actively one. So you may be okay to be mistaken that I'm a football player, and that's what I'm trying to present as, but I'm still not a football player no matter how much I want to pretend to be. The same is true. Buck Angel is not a man. Buck Angel is a woman who is wearing a convincing costume of a man.
Okay. Mel, did you want to respond?
Nope.
All right. Rude Mud Crab with the big 5 follows up saying, I wasn't saying any definition is correct. I was saying that these things aren't the same as one is objective and one is subjective. They're different.
I disagree. I've articulated why there's no utility in allowing the definition to be self-referential and subjective. Even Mel would concede that there are plenty of people that used historically and even currently the concept of gender to be the grammatical categorization of biological sex. And so there, you need to have offensive reasons why we should prefer having a total subjective definition in the way that Mel's suggesting. I don't see those offensive reasons. Any slight offense that there is has to do with not erasing people, which is solved by having other terms. You could do studies on trans people without having to subvert the language that means that gender is a grammatical categorization of biological reality.
Mel, did you have a response?
Nope.
Okay. All right. And Rob, did you say you needed to leave around midnight? Because I believe it's...
I could stick around till 1. I want to stick around for some people to come on. I don't want to because there might be some people chomping at the bit to just punch me in the face. So
yeah,
give them
I think
a chance.
there are back there.
That's fine.
Okay. And Mel, are you staying for open panel?
I want to. I kind of want to understand something. If you've said Jim Bob has done this before as well, why is he still allowed on your platform? But
oh my God, this is a whataboutism kind of stupidity. All right, we're going to kick off open
panel. I'm asking
panel.
if you have a double standard.
You either stay or you
Do you have a double standard?
The choice is
the
yours.
reason I put so much work into these